understand judicial philosophy matters. There's differences. I think everybody in America can get 3 hours of credit for originalism. It's the most detailed explanation of legal philosophy I think any nominee has provided to the Senate, and I appreciate that. Senator Harris mentioned about how much more candid Justice Ginsburg was. And with all due respect to Senator Harris, I don't agree with that. I think Justice Ginsburg established the Ginsburg rule for a reason. But what she cited in terms of evidence of candor was a very articulate statement by Justice Ginsburg as to why she embraced the pro-choice point of view. That's not being candid about the law. That's being candid about who you are. I think it's pretty clear to everybody who's been watching these hearings that you and your family are pro-life, that you are a practicing Catholic, and you adhere to the tenets of your faith. But I hope people also understand that you have made a pledge to the committee and to the country at large that you will set aside whatever religious views you have when it comes time to decide the law. There's already been an example in the Seventh Circuit where you upheld a legislative provision that restricted access to abortion clinics in terms of protesting. I think it's the Bubble case. So I'm highly confident that you will judge every American based on their case, not the law of Amy. And here's what is important to me. Senator Blackburn and Ernst are two conservative women on this committee. It is a very give and take society called America, but there's one group in America I think has had a hard time of it, and that's conservatives of color and women conservatives. There's an effort by some in the liberal world to marginalize the contribution because you come out on a different side of an issue, particularly abortion. So this hearing to me is an opportunity to not punch through a glass ceiling, but a reinforced concrete barrier around conservative women. You're going to shatter that barrier. I have never been more proud of a nominee than I am of you. You've been candid to this body about who you are, what you believe. You've been reassuring in your disposition, and this is history being made, folks. This is the first time in American history that we've nominated a woman who's unashamedly pro-life and embraces her faith without apology, and she's going to the court. A seat at the table is waiting on you, and it will be a great signal to all young women who share your view of the world that there's a seat at the table for them. This won't be celebrated in most places. It'd be hard to find much commentary about this moment in American history, but in many of our worlds, this will be celebrated. This has been a long time coming, and we have arrived. So I want to thank President Trump for giving you the opportunity to showcase your talents. I believe that Justice Sotomayor and Kagan were incredibly qualified women of great character, disposition, and integrity, and I believe the same about you. So let's talk a little bit about yesterday, Obamacare. This hearing has been more about Obamacare than it has you. Obamacare is on the ballot. If you want socialized single-payer health care, that's on the ballot. Why do many of us object to Obamacare? It was written and passed on a partisan line, I think on Christmas Eve. Most big changes in society have more buy-in than that. You're talking about 1/5 of the American economy. And as I said yesterday, from a South Carolina point of view, this has not worked out well. We started with 5 exchanges. We're down to 1. You have one choice. 4 rural hospitals have closed. Premiums have gone up, not down, by an average of 30%. And when you look at the formula used by Obamacare, I can understand why Senator Harris likes it the way it is. I can understand why Chuck Schumer likes it the way it is. 3 states get 35% of all of Obamacare dollars. New York, California, Massachusetts, they're 22% of the population. In South Carolina, if you had a per patient formula, no matter where you lived, you got the same contribution from the federal government, South Carolina would receive almost an additional $1 billion. I don't blame California, New York, and Massachusetts for wanting more. People in South Carolina should blame me and Senator Scott for accepting that construct. So when it comes to health care, we all have our different positions, but today is about you. And today is about whether or not you're qualified to serve on the highest court in the land. Severability. Can you tell me again, I know you've been asked 100 times, the doctrine of severability, what does it mean? Push the red button. Yeah.
Okay.
Think so. No, I can't hear you now.
It's not.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
So the doctrine of severability is a doctrine essentially of statutory interpretation. And what it means is if you have a statute, and the Affordable Care Act is obviously a very long statute, if there's one provision within the statute that's unconstitutional, the question is whether that one section can simply be rendered null and excised from the statute, severed, so that the rest of the law stands, or whether that provision is so central to the statute that its unconstitutionality, like once it's pulled out, the whole house of cards collapses. And the presumption is always in favor of severability. It's a question of your intent. The court looks, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The main thing is the doctrine of severability has a presumption to save the statute if possible. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I want every conservative in the nation to listen to what she just said. The doctrine of severability presumes, and its goal is to preserve the statute if that is possible. So from a conservative point of view, generally speaking, we want legislative bodies to make laws, not judges. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And would it be further true that if you can preserve a statute, you try to the extent possible?
That is true.
Okay. That's the law, folks. Abortion. You were read some statements by, I think it's what's the name of the pro-life group, county?
The St. Joseph County Right to Life.
Okay. And you were asked by Senator Blumenthal, who I respect, whether or not their policy positions were illegal. Do you remember that?
I remember him asking me whether I accepted other policy positions on in vitro fertilization and whether it was a rejection of Roe.
Yeah. Well, I remember an exchange where they took a statement from that group or some other group arguing for the criminalization. Okay. Remember that? The criminalization of IVF, is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And here's my problem with that analysis. That was a position taken by a pro-life county organization. It's not your job to pass judgment on the thoughts and beliefs of Americans, is it, as a Supreme Court justice?
No, it is not.
So when they argue that something should be criminal, they have a right to make that argument, right?
They do. It also wasn't in the ad that appeared next to the statement I said.
The main thing is, how does something become criminal in our legal system in America?
When a legislative body passes a statute.
So here's what I want you to know. Statements by political organizations are not law. And what we tried to do yesterday was turn a pro-life group into a legislative body and tried to get you to rule on their beliefs. I think that is a dangerous thing for Americans to be asking a judge to do, whether you're on the right or the left. Here's a statement from an organization I don't particularly agree with, and I want you to pass judgment as to whether or not that's legal. The question for you would be, if some legislative body tried to criminalize this procedure, then that would be subject to litigation in court. Is that correct?
That is correct.
A case in controversy doesn't arise because you disagree with a statement of a private person or a private group. Is that correct?
That is correct.
A case in controversy arises around criminal law when somebody passes a criminal statute. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Then and only then would you determine the constitutionality of that provision. Is that correct?
Well, actually, not even then. The statute would have to be enforced against somebody, so a prosecutor would have to try to hold someone criminally liable for getting IVF, for example.
So the case in controversy concept would have to mature.
Yes, there would be quite a lot of maturation required.
Yeah, before it got to the Supreme Court, if it ever did. So I just want every American to know it's not the judge of it's not the role of a Supreme Court justice to pass judgment on your opinions. It's the role of a Supreme Court justice in very limited circumstances to pass judgment on laws passed by legislative bodies and in other circumstances, regulation, I would suppose. Now, voting. Is it appropriate for legislative bodies to protect the integrity of the ballot box?
So any specific measures that legislative bodies took to protect the integrity of the ballot box could be subject to litigation, subject to challenge.
And that's right. And as they are developed, the courts will hear cases if cases and controversies arise, right?
Yes.
One of the reasons we don't have an agreement with the House is that in their $2.2 trillion package, they're mandating ballot harvesting as a national policy. I think it's ripe for fraud. We've seen evidence of ballots being placed in people's cars and dropped in ditches. So I think there will be an effort, I hope, to protect the integrity of the ballot and also ensure easy voting. I don't think they're contrary goals for the nation. Now, when it comes to being on the court itself and collaborating with other members of the court, what's your experience been at the Seventh Circuit level? How's that played out?
It is so collegial. We all collaborate. I have the greatest respect and have had wonderful interactions with every single one of my colleagues.
Do you think you have the capability to fit in at the Supreme Court?
I hope so.
Okay. So we talked a lot about laws legalizing same-sex marriage. What's the name of the case?
Obergefell.
Okay. And you would, if anybody tried to change that precedent, one of the things you would look at is a reliance interest that people have formed around that piece of legislation?
Yes.
Same with Casey and Roe?
Yes.
Okay. So reaching a decision that the case was wrongly decided doesn't end the debate in terms of whether or not it should be repealed. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And there is a very rigorous process in place to overturn precedent?
There is many factors, reliance being one.
Okay. Is there any constitutional right to a polygamous relationship?
Let's see. That might be a question that could be litigated at, polygamy, obviously, in many places is illegal now, but that could be an issue somebody might litigate before the court at some point.
Yeah, somebody might make the argument it's possible for three people to love each other genuinely, and that would work its way to the court if somebody wanted to make that argument. Is that correct?
Somebody could, make that argument.
So you've been asked a lot about Roe v. Wade and Casey, and one of the differences between Braun versus Board of Education and Roe line of cases is there's active litigation regarding Roe. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I think Senator Hirano named 8 or 9 different cases that may come up to the court, cases in controversy. And one of the reasons you can't tell us how you would rule is because there's active litigation coming to the court. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And one of the reasons you can say with confidence that you think Braun versus Board of Education is super precedent is that you're not aware of any effort to go back to the good old days of segregation by a legislative body. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I've also said that in lectures that Braun was correct as an original matter. So that is the kind of thing, since I've said it in writing, I felt like I could express before the committee.
When it comes to Hiller, there's legislative bodies all over the country passing laws regarding gun ownership. Are you aware of that?
I am aware of that.
Okay, when it comes to Citizens United, I think there'll be some efforts after this election to maybe revisit that case. So the thing that I'm trying to establish here is that Heller, Citizens United, Roe, Casey are all actively being litigated because legislative bodies are playing in that arena. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
So your point to us is when it's likely that case and controversies around the holding of a particular case are going to come to the court, there's only so much you can tell us about what you may or may not do.
Absolutely.
So that Roe v. Wade compared to Brown versus Board of Education is not super president.
Not super precedent, as I was using that term in the articles that have been referred to.
And let me tell you from a common sense point of view why it's not super precedent. I have legislation. 14 states have passed a law that I'm trying to get passed up here, that in the 5th month of pregnancy, 20 weeks, an unborn child is capable of feeling pain. I'm making the argument there's a compelling state interest to protect that unborn child from a very painful death called abortion. There's only 7 nations on the entire planet that allow abortion on demand in the 5th month. Now that's a political exercise we're going through. 14 states have passed a version of what I've just described. That will be coming to the court, I would imagine, in the future. All I ask is that will you listen to both sides of the argument if it gets to you?
I will.
Thank you. Judge, all I can say, I've met a lot of people in this business and very impressive people. One of the highlights of my time on the committee is to get to meet incredibly talented, smart, squared-away people. Justice Roberts sat right before you and didn't have a note. A lot of people on my side are upset with him about this or that. Sometimes I disagree with him, but I do know this, that he's doing what he thinks is best for the court and for the country. Justice Sotomayor and Kagan, delightful people, incredibly wickedly smart. Justice Kagan had a biting sense of humor, and they're on the court because they should be. They're on the court because they live lives worthy of being on the court. They're on the court because they're some of the smartest people in the land about the law. They're on the court because they lived incredibly productive and meaningful lives. Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh are both on the court for the same reasons. As to you, you're every bit in their league. In my view, this is exactly where you should be going to the Supreme Court, that the United States of America will benefit from your participation at the Supreme Court. You will offer a point of view that millions of Americans share. You will have life experiences that will round out the court. You will apply the law to the facts, and that you are going to inspire a lot of young women, just like Justice Ginsburg did, just like Justice Sotomayor and Kagan did. And the young women that you're going to inspire don't have a whole lot of role models they can point to in terms of the media world in which we live in, uplifting them. That's about to change. To my Democratic colleagues, I understand where you're coming from. I understand what you want the court to do. You want the court to do things differently than we do. I don't question your motives, and I want to thank you for conducting this hearing in a way that has been respectful, has been challenging, and the process will be moving forward here. And from the committee's point of view, I think we're on track to do it in a way that hopefully people will say, even though you disagree strongly, you're not that disagreeable. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Judge, I must say, I'm delighted to see your family here again, and I hope they feel that very special sense of pride in you. I'm sure they do, And I think, I was thinking of my children and grandchildren, and this is really a once-in-a-lifetime occasion. So I hope they find it very special in their lives.
Thank you, Senator.
You're welcome. Yesterday, you spoke of California v. Texas, the current case seeking to strike down the Affordable Care Act. You said, I think, that the issue before the court is severability, meaning whether the court can still uphold the Affordable Care Act if it rules that the individual mandate is unconstitutional. And you said yesterday this question was not before the court. As I understand this, Chief Justice Roberts and the majority did involve the issue of severability in a case known as the NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius. There, the Chief Justice and the 5-4 majority that included Justice Ginsburg struck down one part of the law, the Medicaid expansion provision, but allowed the rest of the law to stand because they found it was severable from the portion they struck down. Justice Scalia dissented from this conclusion, stated that, quote, the unconstitutionality of the individual mandate and the Medicaid expansion requires the invalidation of the Affordable Care Act's other provisions, end quote. In other words, the justice believed that the law was not severable and the entire law had to be struck down, including provisions protecting people with pre-existing conditions. You have been close to the justice's philosophy, and in these hearings, you've also said that this doesn't mean you would reach all the same conclusions. So can you explain to us today how you would disagree or agree with Justice Scalia's view of severability in that NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business case?
Well, what I think I can say without expressing disagreement or agreement for the reasons I said yesterday, not being able to grade precedents, the severability issue, first of all, the majority holding, as you recognized, was that even though the Medicaid provision was unconstitutional, it was severable. So Justice Scalia expressed his view in dissent. Even by Justice Scalia's view, the issue would be different in California versus Texas for two reasons. One, Justice Scalia thought two provisions of the Constitution were unconstitutional. So if you picture severability being like a Jenga game, it's kind of if you pull one out, can you pull it out while it all stands? Or if you pull two out, will it still stand? So Justice Scalia, his view was that if you pulled those two provisions out, could it still stand? And here we're talking about one. And also, Congress has amended the statute since NFIB versus Sebelius, and it's zeroed out the mandate. So now, California versus Texas involves a different provision because of the zeroing out that was done by amendment. So that's how the two cases present slightly different issues.
What do you think of all that?
What do I think of severability? Or
in that instance?
I think the doctrine of severability, as it's been described by the court, serves a valuable function of trying not to undo your work when you wouldn't want a court to undo your work. Severability strives to look at a statute as a whole and say, would Congress have considered this provision so vital that kind of in the Jenga game, pulling it out, Congress wouldn't want the statute anymore. So it's designed to effectuate your intent. But, severability is designed to say, well, would Congress still want the statute to stand even with this provision gone? Would Congress have still passed the same statute without it? So I think insofar as it tries to effectuate what Congress would have wanted, it's the court and Congress working hand in hand.
Thank you. That's quite a definition. I'm really impressed. Thank you. Some have argued that the Medicare program is unconstitutional because, it's an unconstitutional exercise in congressional spending power. They believe that the spending power does not exist at all. In talking about Medicare and Social Security, Professor Mike Rappaport of the University of San Diego Law wrote this: "It is worth remembering that these programs would never have taken their pernicious form if the Constitution's original meaning had been followed in the first place." Do you agree with originalists who say that the Medicare program is unconstitutional? And if so, why?
I'm not familiar with that article by Professor Rappaport, so I don't know what reasoning he advances for claiming that the spending power as exercised in things like the Medicaid provision would be unconstitutional.
Well, it's in Law and Liberty, July 23, 2015. But the question is, do you agree with originalists who say that the Medicare program is unconstitutional?
Well, let's see. So I think I can't answer that question in the abstract, because as we've talked about, the no hints, no forecast, no previews rule. I also don't know what the arguments would be. So I assume Professor Rappaport lays out a case, but it's not a question that I've ever considered before. But if I did consider it, it would be in the context of an actual case or controversy.
Well, I thank you. It's hard for me to believe that that's a real question because I think the Medicare program is really sacrosanct in this country. But let me ask you, last April, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Supreme Court prevented Wisconsin from implementing a district court order that would have extended the state's deadline for submitting absentee ballots. This would have given voters greater flexibility in casting absentee ballots for Wisconsin's primary election. Justice Ginsburg dissented. She criticized the court's majority for putting its head in the sand with regard to the risks posed by COVID-19. She emphasized that courts and election officials must be able to react to a grave, rapidly developing public health crisis. And she noted that the Supreme Court's, quote, suggestion that the current situation is not substantially different from an ordinary election boggles the mind, end quote. Would you agree, and what is your position?
Well, Senator Feinstein, that's obviously a very recent case. And, in that case, the court had to address, the constitutional question. And so, again, it's one of those things that I can't answer, both because it would be requiring me to grade and express agreement or disagreement with the Supreme Court opinion, but also it's the kind of case that could come up in a closely related form, either on the Seventh Circuit, Wisconsin is within the Seventh Circuit's jurisdiction, or on the Supreme Court.
Okay, let me try again with something. After President Trump announced your nomination to the Supreme Court, you discussed the judicial philosophy of the late Justice Antonin Scalia. Specifically, you stated, his judicial philosophy is mine. During oral arguments in the 2013 case Shelby County v. Holder, Justice Scalia questioned the strong congressional support for reenactment of the Voting Rights Act. He argued that this support was not attributable to the fact that we need the Voting Rights Act. Rather, he stated that he believed Congress reenacted the bill due to a, quote, phenomenon that's called perpetuation of racial entitlement, end quote. What is your reading of this and your understanding of the history of the Voting Rights Act?
Well, when I said that Justice Scalia's philosophy is mine too, I certainly didn't mean to say that every sentence that came out of Justice Scalia's mouth or every sentence that he wrote is one that I would agree with. When I said Justice Scalia's philosophy is mine too, what I meant is that his jurisprudential approach to text, as we've talked about originalism and textualism, is the same that I would take. And I think as for the Voting Rights Act, I think that it was obviously a triumph in the civil rights movement.
Well, the question arises in my mind. Of course, my view is that we always need this. This is a bulwark of our democracy. So need, I think, is something that may be somewhat subjective. Do you agree with that?
That need is subjective?
Yes, yeah, that I think we do need a Voting Rights Act, and it's subjective in that sense.
Well, I think Senator Feinstein, the question of how the coverage formula is calculated in the Voting Rights Act and the contours of the Voting Rights Act and whether Shelby County was rightly decided or not are all questions on which I can't give an answer because Shelby County has obviously been controversial. It's likely to be relitigated. It could come up before me on the court.
Well, let me give you, because I think this is really important because it shows the basic philosophical bent of an individual. For me, the Voting Rights Act is extremely important, and it defines our election system to a great extent. It's hard for me to understand that anyone would want to do away with it. What is your position in that regard?
As I understand Shelby County, it said that the coverage formula was outdated from the 1960s for subjecting the particular states, requiring them to get pre-clearance. It's my understanding, and I haven't looked at the case in a while, that everything else about the Voting Rights Act remained intact, including its prohibitions on discrimination in elections. It was just the coverage formula which decided which states were subject to pre-clearance.
Well, let me ask you this question, and this is a hard one. Do you agree with Justice Scalia's assertion that the Voting Rights Act is a, quote, perpetuation of racial entitlement, end quote?
Senator Feinstein, I don't obviously know what Justice Scalia was thinking when he said that. And any characterization of the Voting Rights Act or a statement like that is simply really not something I can opine on because, you know, that's tied in, I would think, with these Shelby County questions.
Well, can you opine? I'm not asking for a formal opinion, but would you believe that it's a perpetuation of racial entitlement?
Well, Senator Feinstein, I think that goes to the question of whether the coverage formula was outdated and needed to be updated from the 1960s or not. I take that to be the thrust of the disagreement in Shelby County and the position that Justice Scalia was taking. So again, I can't express a view on Shelby County and whether the majority or dissent had the better of the argument.
Okay, let me move on to workers' rights and age discrimination. In a 2019 case, Kleber v. CareFusion Corporation, you joined a majority of the Seventh Circuit judges in holding that age discrimination in employment does not protect job applicants against employment practices that have a disproportionately harmful impact on older applicants. The opinion you joined, as I understand it, dismissed a claim brought by a 58-year-old lawyer who was passed over for a job that was offered to a 29-year-old applicant with less experience. I think I'm concerned by the implications of the decision. According to AARP, approximately 35% of the United States population is now 50 years or older. Almost 29% of households are headed by someone near or past retirement age who have no savings or pension. According to the EEOC, study after study has shown age discrimination, quote, remains a significant barrier for older workers, end quote. And older applicants are more frequently denied job interviews than middle-aged applicants. Additionally, older and middle-aged women are subjected to more age discrimination than men. The EEOC has found that the Great Recession during President Bush's administration, quote, forced many older workers to revive their retirement plans, to work longer to recoup drained retirement accounts and lost savings. So here's the question, because I think it's going to be an increasing problem for the court. What do you understand to be the purpose of age discrimination, of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act?
Well, in Kleber versus Care Fusion, I joined a majority of the en banc court, so that was a case that we heard as a full court. And the question is whether the prohibition on age discrimination covered applicants or only employees. And the statute said employees, and so an applicant isn't an employee. So the majority said that the statute, by its terms, didn't cover the conduct. But I think that's an instance, I talked yesterday quite a bit about whose role it is to update statutes or extend them, and I think that's an instance in which Congress could well address this problem by amending the statute to include applicants in it.
So where would you stand on the general subject matter?
Well, since I can't impose the law of Amy, that would be up to the Congress to decide, or many state legislatures have different anti-discrimination prohibitions that offer even more protection than some federal statutes.
Okay. Let's talk for a moment. In 2013, you wrote, and this is a quote, "I tend to agree with those who say that a justice's duty is to the Constitution, and that it's thus more legitimate for her to enforce her best understanding of the Constitution rather than a precedent she thinks clearly conflicts with it. If you are presented with a case where your view of the Constitution conflicts with Supreme Court precedent, what will control your decision? Your understanding of the Constitution or precedent?"
Senator Feinstein, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that quote was mentioned a lot yesterday, and I'm happy to have an opportunity to explain the context. That entire article, I think that there's been some misunderstanding, perhaps because that sentence, first of all, it was citing a footnote to both an originalist scholar and a progressive constitutionalist. But the whole article was defending the Supreme Court's current doctrine, which accords constitutional precedent weaker stare decisis effect than, say, statutory precedent. And I mentioned that yesterday, against claims that we should have no doctrine of stare decisis at all, and against claims that it should be absolute and completely tie the court's hands. So I actually wasn't arguing for any alteration to stare decisis doctrine. I was saying this is how it is, this is how the Supreme Court does it, and that's right. And another couple of sentences in there which I think might put my perspective in context. I said a new majority cannot impose its vision only with votes. It must, now I'm paraphrasing myself, it must be very sure that its interpretation of the Constitution is the right one, and that reliance, interests, etc., don't counsel in favor of its overruling, paraphrased. And then the next sentence was something to the effect of, an uncertainty in that regard counsels in favor of preserving the status quo. So that sentence, if it's just read alone, makes it sound like I'm arguing for the overthrow of stare decisis in constitutional cases altogether, but that wasn't the thrust of the article, quite to the contrary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we all welcome the fact that your family's here. It's a beautiful family.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Thanks,
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Chairman.
Thank you very much. Senator Grassley. Don't start the clock yet. He's not ready. For $5, I won't start the clock.
Judge.
Start the clock.
Welcome back.
Thank you, Senator.
I want to compliment you for doing a very good job answering our questions and all about your decision-making process. You've been forthright, candid, thoughtful, You've demonstrated a tremendous command of and respect for the law and Constitution. You've shown us that your judicial method is rigorous, but also fair and open-minded. Above all, it's clear that you understand the appropriate role of a judge, just what we're looking for, at least on this side of the aisle. An individual who will interpret the law, not one to make it. You are an outstanding candidate. A couple things before I ask my questions. First, Judge, many of my colleagues on the other side have tried to get you to tell us how you rule on a case, whether you believe a case was correctly decided, or whether you'll commit to uphold a specific law. As you've responded, it is not appropriate for you or any nominee in your position, for any level of the judiciary, to make promises or give hints on how you'd rule or what you think about a potential issue that may come up. Judicial independence from the legislative and executive branch, those are our political branches accountable to the people, is a bedrock principle of our constitutional system. Justice Ginsburg said it best, a judge is sworn to decide impartially and can offer no forecasts or hints, because that would show disregard for a particular case. And she also said you can't display disdain, or it would display disdain for the entire judicial process. You testified that you have not made any promises to anyone about how you might rule on a case that might come before you. That's because you know that a judicial nominee should never promise votes in exchange for a president's nomination or a senator's support. Moreover, we saw yesterday, and to some extent Monday, Democrats' strategy continues to be to use scare tactics, distortions, and speculation. They're framing you as a real threat to health care coverage, and especially protections for existing conditions. This is all a charade. Just because of your comment, I believe just from one law review article you wrote, critiquing Chief Justice Roberts' reasoning. So it's time to get real. This is all just a distraction. This is what we saw Monday and Tuesday. Democrats want to distract from the fact that they don't really care about Obamacare. You heard that since Democrats started their presidential primaries probably about 2 years ago. They want government-run Medicare for all. That's what you heard in the Democrat primary. The changes they seek to the ACA move America closer to a single-payer system where the government provides or subsidizes health care for all Americans, which we know eventually leads to government rationing of health care. Democrats want to distract from the fact that they just filibustered a COVID relief bill that would have protected pre-existing conditions. Next Monday, we'll see if they'll vote for a COVID recovery bill that Leader McConnell has scheduled for a vote next week. Democrats want to distract from the fact that Republicans, yes, Republicans, have introduced bills to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions and to bring down drug prices. And if we act, they don't have to worry about you doing away with pre-existing conditions in some future case down the road. In fact, given the opportunity to advance bipartisan prescription drug pricing reduction act, that's the Grassley-Wyden bill, Democrats at Schumer's command walked away because they wanted an election year issue. Republicans passed and signed into law bills to end pharmacy gag clauses and to end abusive drug tactics that prevent lower-cost generic drugs from coming to market. Democrats want to distract from the fact that President Trump and the administration have taken steps to help lower health care costs for Americans, including finalizing a rule to allow the importation of prescription drugs from Canada and proposing a rule to facilitate the purchase of affordable insulin and EpiPen for lower-income Americans. The President has signed an executive order to end surprise billing. Further, I and other Republicans have been working with the administration to increase transparency in drug prices, to step up enforcement of anti-competitive activity and prosecution of bad actors in the healthcare industry, and to improve and expedite regulatory approval of drugs to combat COVID and other diseases. Here is the bottom line of what we've all heard Monday and Tuesday. The Democrats cry foul over anything that may help Americans if it doesn't advance their agenda for Medicare for all. And the American people deserve to be reminded of this hearing what it's all about. It's all about your qualifications to be on the Supreme Court. It's not about health care advocacy. Finally, Judge, Democrats want to distract from the fact that you're eminently qualified for this position you've been nominated for. And they don't like it that you know that the place of the courts is not to rewrite laws as you might see fit there. Here's the bottom line. I've asked you yesterday if it's your agenda to repeal the Affordable Care Act. You said, quote unquote, absolutely not. You said you've never made a commitment to anyone on the Affordable Care Act or on any matter. You've never been asked to make such a commitment. And you made very clear you would never make such a commitment. Mr. Chairman, I want to put some letters in the record from state legislative leaders supporting this nominee.
Without objection.
Now, you won't get away with asking some questions on some things that I'm very interested in. I'd like to discuss a law that I brought up with you when we talked for a short period of time, one-on-one. We didn't discuss it at that time, the False Claims Act. In 1986, we passed legislation that I drafted to make False Claims Act an effective tool to combat fraud against federal programs. This law enlisted the help of private citizens to enforce the False Claims Act through qui tam lawsuits. In 2000, the Supreme Court deemed the false claims qui tam provisions constitutional. As you know, the False Claims Act has emerged as the government's primary weapon against fraud. Since we restored the law in 1986, false claims actions have recovered $68 billion of taxpayers' money fraudulently taken, with $50 billion coming from whistleblower-initiated actions. Congress has remained vigilant to protect the False Claims Act from attempts to weaken it in the courts. Have you ever written or spoken publicly about the constitutionality of qui tam or any other provisions of the False Claims Act? And if so, what were the circumstances or the context?
Senator Grassley, I don't recall ever speaking about the False Claims Act or the constitutionality of the qui tam provisions or any other part of the act. So I can't think of a time when I have.
Do you have any preconceived ideas about the False Claims Act or Whistleblower Protection Act that would impact your ability to impartially decide any cases involving those issues?
I do not. Any case involving that act, I would approach with an open mind as with any other.
Some opponents of the False Claims Act argue that key TAM provisions are unconstitutional under Article 2 and 3. Are you familiar with these legal arguments, and if so, do you have an opinion on them?
Are you talking about the key TAM
Yeah.
challenges?
Yeah.
Well, those aren't ones that I can express an opinion on because, as you say, they've been up before the court.
Another interest of mine that I probably at 87 years of age won't live long enough to see done, but I've discussed cameras in the courtroom and introduced legislation on that over the last 15 years. It's not a very popular subject. Judge Souter joked that he'd have to roll over in his dead body before they'd put cameras on the Supreme Court. While I can respect that point of view, I totally disagree. Many of us believe that allowing cameras in the courtroom would open the courts to the public and bring about a better understanding of the judiciary. For many years, that bill that I've introduced has been called the Sunshine in the Courtroom Act, a bill to give judges the discretion to allow media coverage of federal court proceedings. I'm also a co-sponsor of Senator Durbin's bill to allow cameras in the Supreme Court. I understand that the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, where you currently serve, adopted procedures to allow requests for video recording of oral arguments as well as public release of the recordings.
That's correct.
Has your court had any problems with these procedures? What are your views on allowing cameras in the courtroom? If confirmed, would you keep an open mind about allowing cameras in the Supreme Court?
I would certainly keep an open mind about allowing cameras in the Supreme Court.
I always ask people, district, circuit, or Supreme Court, this question about international law. I'd like to get your views on how and when you would apply international law to your decision-making process. Is it ever appropriate to cite international law when interpreting the U.S. Constitution?
Well, I would never want to say never because it's certainly possible. Generally speaking, so it's been applied in the issues with which foreign law has been applied, and there's a debate about it, are when we're trying, or when the court is trying, or the lower court is trying, to identify what is the nature of a right that's part of the tradition of the people, or that the people, like what would the people view? And in my view, the United States Constitution is a compact, and it's the fundamental law of the American people. And so I don't think it would be controlled by the laws passed by other countries because it reflects the fundamental commitments that we as an American people have made.
Thank you very much. I reserve my time.
Senator Durbin. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize, Senator Lee. Apologize.
I've got a comment to
Yeah,
do
no,
on
out of
this.
sight, out of mind. I apologize.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Incidentally, for those who are watching and think that we may be polarized in things, I listened to what Senator Grassley said about cameras in the courtroom, and of course I agree with him on that, and he knows I have supported that. I've also joined with him in a few of the False Claim Act improvements. So there are many areas in our committee where senators have worked together. And I would ask, Mr. Chairman, if I could, unanimous consent, that a letter from 10 former federal judges who are opposed to the process of this nomination, along with letters of opposition to the nomination from People for the American Way, NARO, and 208 women lawyers, and that they be inserted in the record.
Without objection.
You have to assume that somebody's going to hand you those letters. I can't quite reach from my room here. Now, Judge Barrett, it was good to see you again. I commend your children. I'm sure this is fascinating, but I'm sure it's a long day. And I'm sure you probably felt the same way, but this is part of democracy, and it's important that we have these questions. Now, we're being told that no one could possibly know how you would rule in the latest Republican-led case to overturn the Affordable Care Act. But what we do know is that you criticized Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in NFIB versus Sebelius. You stated that, quote, Roberts pushed the ACA beyond its plausible meaning to save the statute. And then you praised the dissent in King versus Burwell. So it seems every time you weigh in on the legality of the statute, you come to one conclusion. The Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. Now, over the past 2 weeks, you provided this committee, all of us, with some 1,800 pages of your writings and speeches for us to review, and I have. Now, I may have missed something in that, but did you ever write or speak out in defense of the ACA?
Senator Leahy, I just wanted to make one correction. King versus Burwell wasn't a case about whether the Affordable Care Act was constitutional or not. That one was purely a question of statutory interpretation. So just to make clear about that.
But you did praise the dissent. You did praise the dissent and not the fighting.
I did. In a radio interview, I said that I thought the dissent had the better of the statutory interpretation argument. I have a couple of things, I guess, that maybe might help shed some light on this question. One is that, of course, in both of those contexts, I was speaking as an academic. And as I mentioned yesterday, an academic serves a very different function than a judge. So an academic doesn't go through the judicial process, doesn't hear the case or controversy, have the litigants and the briefs and the consultation with colleagues, the right to give an opinion.
We all understand that, but that's not my question. My question was, did you ever write or speak out in defense of the ACA, whether as a academic or as a member of the judiciary? That's a pretty simple question. Could be answered yes or no.
No, I've never had occasion to speak on a policy question.
And so every time you weighed in on it, you said the law is unconstitutional. Now,
sorry, I thought you were done.
well, and the court, of course, have to it's going to have to look at both severability, standing, constitutionality, and you haven't written on severability of the ACA, have you?
I have not.
Thank you. And now, here's a quote that I'm sure you're familiar with in preparing for this, and it's been used in the last few days. Quote is, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Have you heard that quote before?
I believe that's from the dissent in Shelby County.
By Justice Ginsburg, is that correct?
I believe so.
Actually, it is. She was talking about and warning about striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, Shelby County, it was almost like immediately after Shelby County came down, states started making changes. 20 states enacted new restrictions on voting. And some of those restrictions have been horrendous. Do you know how many polling places have arbitrarily been closed across the country since the Shelby decision?
I do not know, Senator Leahy.
I'll help you there. It's at least 1,600. Now, following the Shelby decision, do you know how many voters were purged from voting rolls?
I do not know.
Well, roughly 16 million. That's about 30 times the population of my state. African Americans with felonies are 4 times more likely to be disenfranchised than other Americans with felony convictions. And non-white voters are 7 times more likely to wait in line for more than an hour than, black voters wait longer in line than white voters. I mention this because this is a picture from DeKalb County, Georgia. Those are the lines. African Americans make up the majority. Look at that line. I suspect neither you nor I have ever had to wait in line like that to vote. In fact, the press reported that today those lines could be 10 hours long. People talked about, well, are we giving racial entitlement? This is not entitlement for any Americans. This is not entitlement. This is turning our back on democracy. This is saying, you can't vote, or we're going to make it so difficult for you to vote, you can't. Harris County in Texas, which has population many times that of my state, has 1 early voting spot. People have to drive for hours and wait in line for hours to get there. Would you accept the fact, or would you acknowledge the fact that communities of color disproportionately face restrictions and obstacles when they are casting their ballots?
Senator, I wasn't aware of the statistics that you were citing to me. If it became relevant in any case that was litigated before me and was presented to me, I would, of course, have an open mind about it.
Well, I talk about this because I know you have spoken feeling much like former Justice Scalia, who I would know was a friend of mine. But I disagreed with him on many things. He talked about racial entitlement. It's not racial entitlement when blacks have to stand in line for 10 hours to vote. And Justice Ginsburg, of course, dissented in Shelby. She knew what the consequences would be. I only mention that because it's okay for a judge not to close his or her eyes to reality. Now, I asked you last week what a Justice Barrett would do if a president or even a senator did not follow a Supreme Court decision. You declined. You said the question may come before you. I then asked if the Supreme Court would have the final word. You stated the Supreme Court would have the final word as far as the lower courts are concerned. And that surprised me, and it concerned me, and I'll tell you why. I asked Justice Gorsuch and I asked Justice Kavanaugh those questions. I asked them what happens then, and they made it clear that a president cannot refuse to comply with a court order, and the Supreme Court's word is the final word on that matter. That's what Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh said. So I would ask you this. Do you agree that a president must follow a court order, and the Supreme Court's word is final? Or is the Supreme Court's word only final as far as the lower courts are concerned?
Senator Leahy, I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify from our conversation. First, I know that both Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh said that no man is above the law, and I agree with that. But I conversed with Senator Lee yesterday about Federalist 78, which says that courts have neither force nor will. In other words, we can't do anything to enforce our own judgments. And so what I meant in the conversation with you is that as a matter of law, the Supreme Court may have the final word, but the Supreme Court lacks control over what happens after that. The Supreme Court and any federal court has no power, no force, and no will, so it relies on the other branches to react to its judgments accordingly.
I remember as a young law student having lunch, our honor society at Georgetown was able to have lunch with the members of the Supreme Court. I sat with Justice Hugo Black. He told me what happened with Braun versus Board of Education. And the court knew that was going to be a very, very tough case. And what did they do? They waited till they had a unanimous opinion because they knew that the president would have to, and the Congress would have to enforce their law. So let me ask you this. Of course, the Supreme Court has no army. They have no force, but they do have the force of law. And is a president who refuses to comply with a court order a threat to our constitutional system of checks and balances?
Senator Leahy, I think the example of Braun is a perfect one in this instance because the Supreme Court in Braun, of course, held that segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause. That was the law, but as you know, there was resistance to that decision. And so it wasn't until the National Guard came in and forced Governor Falbus to allow desegregation that it could happen because the Supreme Court couldn't do so itself. And in Cooper versus...
I understand that, but they made the order. And could a president, if a president refused to follow what they had said, would that be a threat to our constitutional form of government?
Well, as I said, the Supreme Court can't control whether or not the president obeys. Abraham Lincoln once disobeyed an order during the Civil War of a circuit court. So a court can pronounce the law and issue a judgment, but it lacks control over how the political branches respond to it.
Well, then let me ask you a specific that has come up. President Trump claims he has an absolute right to pardon himself. Now, for 200 years, the Supreme Court has recognized the common law principle that nobody can be a judge in their own case. I had to go way back and reread Calder versus Bull to see that. But would you agree, first, that nobody is above the law? Not the president, not you, not me. Is that correct?
I agree, no one is above the law.
And does a president have an absolute right to pardon himself for a crime? I mean, we heard this question after President Nixon's impeachment.
Senator Leahy, so far as I know, that question has never been litigated. That question has never arisen. That question may or may not arise, but it's one that calls for a legal analysis of what the scope of the pardon power is. So because it would be opining on an open question when I haven't gone through the judicial process to decide it, it's not one on which I can offer a view.
Okay, and so, but you were willing to say that no person, not you, not me, not a president, is above the law. I find your answers somewhat incompatible, but those are your answers. You have a right to say what you want. Now, you're an originalist. Can you explain why the framers include the foreign and domestic emoluments clause in the Constitution?
I think I could speak generally to what is the well-accepted view that the foreign emoluments clause, it's plain from that text that it's designed to prevent foreign influence in government affairs.
It's sort of the anti-corruption clause of the Constitution, isn't it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
It is sort of what you would say, that it's the anti-corruption clause in the Constitution?
I don't know if I would characterize it as an anti-corruption clause. I think I would characterize it just as I did, which one, from its very text, you can see is designed to prevent foreign countries from having influence.
I was thinking of what at the Constitutional Convention, Governor Edmund Randolph said the clause was thought proper in order to exclude corruption and foreign influence, prohibit anyone in office from receiving or holding any emoluments from foreign states. And now we find that 200 companies and foreign governments have patronized Trump properties. At the same time, they were getting benefits from him and the administration. First 2 years of his presidency, he earned $73 million from his properties abroad. And an originalist, as you are, do you think these companies and foreign governments would have fallen within the framers' zone of concern in writing the emolument clause?
Senator, the emoluments clause, it's under litigation. There was a Fourth Circuit case that recently involved this question. So as a matter that's being litigated, it's very clear that that would be one that I can't express an opinion on because it could come before me.
I've found it interesting what you've written about stare decisis and precedent, and it seems that you're willing to depart from it, and that's, as a justice, I suppose you could do what you want, but in the June medical services, Chief Justice Roberts joined the majority, struck down a Louisiana law restricting access to reproductive services, even though he had dissented in a previous case, striking down a very similar Texas law. He said the legal doctrine of stare decisis requires us, absent special circumstances, to treat cases alike. So having been on the losing side in the first one, he took that position of that case. Do you agree that he demonstrated a commitment to stare decisis in this case?
Well, Senator, no justice that I'm aware of throughout history has ever maintained the position that overruling a case is never appropriate. As you probably know, there's a Supreme Court case that said that states could criminalize sexual conduct between same-sex couples, and Lawrence versus Texas overruled that case. Plessy versus Ferguson was precedent, and Braun versus the Board of Education overruled it. So the Supreme Court has always said that in some cases, overruling precedent is the right course for the court to take, but that it's not done willy-nilly.
I would urge you to read what Chief Justice Roberts said at the opening of the African American Museum in the Smithsonian about following precedent. I realize my time is up. I'm going to I'll submit a question to you because I wonder what restrictions you see on the President's authority under Executive Order 12333 to conduct surveillance activities that haven't been authorized by Congress. I ask that because Senator Lee and I and others have done a lot of legislation on surveillance, and now we question whether that's being ignored. So I hope you will take it as a serious question and answer it for the committee.
Thank you, Senator Leahy.
Thank you. We'll make sure that happens, Senator Leahy. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that 3 letters I have here in my hand be made part of the record, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. Good morning, Judge.
Good morning, Senator.
I'd like to wax philosophical with you for a few minutes, and you don't need your notepad. I just think there's been so much discussion about the role of judges and the role of the political branches. I think maybe it's worth going back to first principles. And to me, the The most important first principle is in the Declaration of Independence, where it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men," and here's the most important part I want to emphasize, "deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now, you and I talked a little bit about consent of the governed as being the very foundation of the legitimacy of government action. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that.
And does that inform your philosophy when it comes to the appropriate role of judges and the political branches like the Congress?
Yes, it does.
I had the great privilege of serving on the state court bench for 13 years, and so when I came to Congress, I'd never served in the legislature before, and so it was quite an eye-opening experience for me. For example, after one vote on the Senate floor, after the vote was over, one senator got to the microphone. He said, "Now for a little legislative history." That was kind of shocking to me, but you understand where I'm getting at. And one reason I appreciate your approach and Justice Scalia's approach to statutory interpretation and emphasis on the text rather than legislative history, this is a way for somebody who lost the vote to come in and try to then tilt the scales of justice in their favor by adding some ex parte legislative history. And then imagine my shock when I served, as I do now, on the Finance Committee. When we mark up legislation in the Finance Committee, we don't actually get to look at legislative text. It's kind of surreal. They call it a notional markup. In other words, we end up voting on sort of a notion or concept, and then somebody in the Leg Counsel's office writes up the text. Very strange. And then there's this issue of, I know in the judiciary and in the legal profession generally, there's been a big movement toward plain language so people can understand clearly. You have to unlearn some of the lessons you learned in law school, particularly writing on law reviews and the like, where you are seemingly are rewarded for this really obtuse, impenetrable language, and of course where you use Latin phrases and things like that. But the plain language movement in the legal profession strikes me as a very important movement, and I yearn for those days when perhaps Congress can embrace that so we can speak more clearly, so more people can understand and not delegate our legislative responsibilities to staff. But I also was struck by the fact that one of the reasons why cases get litigated is because of the failure of the Congress to build consensus for legislation. And to me, the Affordable Care Act is one example of that. When either side pushes through a partisan piece of legislation, it's not realistic to expect that the fight will be over. It'll just move to a different form. It'll move to the courts. That's not what happened on things like Medicare and Social Security. There was built a broad bipartisan consensus. In other words, members of Congress actually did the hard work to find that consensus so that they didn't have to hand it off to the judiciary. And unfortunately, I think we've seen a tendency in recent years to do exactly that, where Congress has abdicated its responsibilities, figuratively, let me say, pull the pin on a hand grenade and then hand it to the judiciary and say, you figure it out. And maybe, just maybe, that's one reason why these judicial confirmation hearings have become so contentious, because people actually see the judiciary as the ultimate policymaker. And as was quoted, I think, Justice Scalia talking about the value judgments of judges versus those of the citizenry or elected representatives. And he said that there's no reason to think that the value judgments of the judiciary are any better than those of the citizens that ultimately, in whom resides the ultimate legitimacy and political power. And of course, the most fundamental difference, I guess, between the job that you currently hold and the one that you will hold on the Supreme Court is the notion of accountability. As a judge, you serve for lifetime tenure, correct?
Correct.
You don't have to stand for election.
No.
You don't have to raise money.
No.
You don't have to consult polls.
No.
Focus groups.
No.
Well, how in the world do you decide a case if you don't consult with public opinion, polls, focus groups, or the like?
Well, the reason we have life tenure as federal judges is to be insulated from the pressure that such things like focus groups or polls or public opinion might, the pressure that it might apply for a court to decide a case a particular way or the other. That's why we decided according to the text.
Well, and there are various rules of the road, so to speak, for how the judiciary approaches cases, right?
Correct.
In other words, perhaps the most fundamental difference is that rather than making broad policy pronouncements, you decide cases, correct?
That is correct.
And in fact, I'm struck by a New York University Law Review article by Justice Ginsburg in, I forgot what year it is, but where she talks about Roe versus Wade. And she talks about what she called the breathtaking decision versus the court's more cautious dispositions. She said, suppose the court had stopped after rightly declaring unconstitutional a portion of the law and had not gone on, as it did in Roe, to fashion a regime blanketing the subject, a set of rules that displaced virtually every state law that enforced. Would there have been a 20-year controversy we have witnessed, reflected most recently in the Supreme Court's splinter decision in Planned Parenthood versus Casey? Might it have served to reduce rather than to fuel controversy? Well, I think what she's saying is when the courts step in and basically take over by stating a constitutional rule, it really prevents the very people who are elected by voters from making policy, correct?
Correct.
And there are a number of other things other than the requirement of a case or controversy that keep the judiciary in its appropriate lane, things like standing requirement.
Yes.
What is standing?
Standing means that you can't just come to court, say, because you dislike Senator Graham's Fetal Pain Act. You can't just walk into the door of the courthouse and say, I don't like that act and I think it's unconstitutional. Standing means that you actually have to have suffered what the law calls a concrete injury, so it has to have affected you in some way. So that means that there are real litigants with a live controversy before the court. People can't come to court to air policy disagreements only.
And then there's a requirement of ripeness. What is ripeness?
Ripeness means that there has to be a live controversy. You can't run to the courthouse door and file a lawsuit until it's ripe, which means that the injury I was talking about has actually come to fruition, come to pass.
And of course, by the time you see it on the circuit court, the case has already had to have been tried by a trial court, correct?
That is correct.
And then there's a record, right?
Yes.
And what encompasses a record that the trial court prepares that you review as an appellate judge?
Well, there'll be factual parts of the record. So if there was a trial, there'll be very lengthy transcript of that trial. A district court makes a number of legal rulings in the course of a case. So the court may have ruled on, say, a motion to dismiss and whether the law even permitted this, whether the law gave the plaintiff a valid claim. The court may have ruled on a motion for summary judgment, which means that's an evaluation of whether the plaintiff or the defendant could win the case without even going through a full trial because the law was clear enough. So there are many things along the way. There are evidentiary rulings, legal rulings, a factual record that develops, and in some instances, it's quite long.
And as an appellate judge on the Seventh Circuit, you can't go outside the record, can you?
You can't. The record can't be expanded on appeal.
And that's true in the Supreme Court as well?
Yes.
And so all of these rules of the road, I'll call them, things like the case or controversy requirement, ripeness, standing, being confined to a record that is then the sole focus of an appellate review. Do all of those things, are all those sort of indications of how the judicial decision-making process is different from the legislative process?
Yes, and it can take years for a case to wind itself through that process. So as opposed to policymakers that don't have to wait on real parties and real disputes, and the parties get to shape the case their way, they get to decide what legal issues they're going to contest, and that narrows what the court can do. So policymakers, if you had, enough agreement to pass something, you could just do it in one day, just enact the law, enact the policy, and that is definitely not how judicial decision-making works.
Well, I know that you have followed the same rule as Justice Ginsburg in not expressing opinions on cases that might come before the court. Is this another practical reason why you can't predict how you will rule in the future? Because you don't know what the facts of that case may be. You don't know what the issues in controversy might be. So how in the world could you sit here and basically tell us about what your policy will be without knowing all of that?
I couldn't, and I think when Justice Ginsburg said it would show disregard for the judicial process and even disregard for litigants, what she was getting at is that it would signal to litigants, listen, all the briefs and stuff you file in a case, that doesn't really matter because judges just have a gut reaction. They just, they know what they think, and this is all just going through the motions. But that's not how the judicial process should work or does work.
There's no reason to believe that a judge's gut reaction is any better than any other American citizen's reaction, is there?
No, and the judicial process, I described this a little bit yesterday, a judge needs to have an open mind every step of the way. So as I said, I've changed my mind at oral argument even after reading the briefs. I've changed my mind at conference after consulting with my colleagues. So if I were to just say how I thought I would resolve a case just because I saw the issue, it would be short-circuiting that whole process through which I should go and have an open mind and be open to persuasion.
Well, I don't see any of the big blow-ups or charts here today about individuals that were the subject of the stories that our Democratic friends were telling yesterday. Maybe we'll see them later. But to me, the idea that some case that you might decide in the future that you have not had a chance to go through this analysis of and predicting how you might rule in the case, is that even possible?
It's not possible because I don't know whether my mind could be changed at some step along the way. And if I did it, I think I said yesterday, I'd be kind of like a legal pundit, just commenting on things in real time. And I don't think anyone wants judges to function that way. They want judges to go through the process, take things seriously, do a lot of research, do a lot of writing, keep an open mind.
And where in the Constitution does it authorize a judge to be a legal pundit and just make policy pronouncements separated from all of these requirements?
Well, Article 3 prohibits it, and so far as Article 3, the court has said prohibits federal courts from issuing what are called advisory opinions. And that means that when there's no real case in front of you, no real case or controversy, then you can't just offer an advisory opinion that's not the resolution of a case to express your view of the law.
So it's not fair, is it, to suggest that by confirming you to this position, you're somehow going to adversely impact the lives of these individuals?
Well, as I said yesterday, what I can say is that I have certainly no agenda. I'm not on a mission. I'm not hostile to the ACA at all. And if I were on the court and if a case involving the ACA came before me, I would approach it with an open mind, just like I do every case, and go through the process that we've just discussed.
And again, referring back to what Justice Ginsburg said in this New York University Law Review article, if judges restrict themselves to deciding cases or controversies as opposed to making broad policy announcements and displacing legitimate dispute, debate, negotiation, and legislation, does that encourage more litigation and dissension, or does it resolve it?
Well, without commenting on what Justice Ginsburg said about Roe versus Wade in particular.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about generally speaking.
Just as a general matter, the case or controversy requirement, insofar as it ties the court to the particular litigants and to the particular issue presented in the case. In fact, the Supreme Court has a rule that it will not consider questions outside of the question presented in the case, absent unusual circumstances. And so that means that the court can't reach out and decide other issues that might be in the case if it didn't grant cert on them. And so I think incremental decision-making or a court limiting itself to the issues actually presented is one way that the court tries to respect this constraint on its power, that it's only actually resolving the cases right in front of it.
And getting back to the Declaration of Independence and the source of governmental legitimacy, this structure, these arrangements are not made to benefit you or the courts or to benefit us. They're to benefit the American people by making sure that they are the ones who are the source of political power. Do you agree with that?
All provisions in the Constitution are there to benefit the people.
And so if the court rules on a statute, we can change the statute, but but the court says something is unconstitutional, you could amend the Constitution to change that ruling. The people could do that, right?
Yes, they could.
So the American people are the final word.
Yes.
Mr. President, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Judge Barrett, good to see you again.
Good morning.
Thank you. You're making history. You're the first, I wish the senator from Idaho could hear this, you are the first nominee for a vacancy on the Supreme Court to be considered after July 1st of the election year. In fact, you're the first nominee to ever be considered in the midst of an election. I don't know if that has ever happened before. It certainly hasn't in modern history. And the obvious question is why? What's the hurry? Why couldn't we wait till the end of November or December or even January after leaving a vacancy on the court for 10 months after Anton Scalia's passing? Well, because there is a political agenda here. And whether you are privy to it, part of it, notwithstanding, it has to do with the Affordable Care Act. November 10th is the absolute date they have to fill the vacancy if the president and those who support him and those who support the Republican platform are going to keep their promise to end the Affordable Care Act. They need that ninth justice, and that's why it has to be hurried. Unfortunately, that is the cloud, the orange cloud over your nomination as it comes before us here in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it raises many questions. I'd like to confine my first part of these questions to what's going on across America as we meet here today. There's an election going on. People are trying to vote. And there are a lot of issues out there that are being debated and somewhat resolved or unresolved every single day. The president continues to lie about paper ballots, saying that they are fraudulent, people shouldn't use them. There's still long lines, unforgivably long lines, for people who just want to exercise their right to vote, the governed who want to give their consent, Senator Cornyn. There's a battle royal over the Postal Service and whether it's going to be implicated in some effort to slow down or stop ballots from being delivered. One ballot collection box in Harris County, Texas, for more than 4 million people, one box. It's pretty clear what's going on here. It's an effort to make it difficult to vote, even for those who are legally entitled. Historically, the Republican Party is starting using a tactic of discouraging voters. We've seen this, making it more difficult. reducing the period of time that people can vote early, requiring IDs even if there's no evidence of fraud, purging the rolls of names. This is all going on. So I want to confine my questions at the outset here on the question of voting. And let me start with what many people read this morning, and I did, which was a summary of one of the exchanges yesterday here in the committee. It was Senator Feinstein who said President Trump made claims of voter fraud and suggested he wanted to delay the upcoming election. Senator Feinstein then asked you, does the Constitution give the President of the United States the authority, listen closely to what she asked you, to unilaterally delay a general election under any circumstances? Does federal law? Your answer, well, Senator, if that question ever came before me, I would need to hear arguments from the litigants, read briefs and consult with my law clerks, talk to my colleagues, go through the opinion writing process. You went on to say you didn't want to give off-the-cuff answers like a pundit, but rather approach matters with an open mind. Is that still your response?
Senator, I've given that response to every hypothetical that I've been asked in the hearings, and as I said yesterday, I do that regardless whether it's easy or hard. I don't do that to try to, whether the question, would be easy or hard. I don't try to do that to signal it, but I do that because it would be inappropriate for me to make a comment, and I don't think I've answered any legal hypotheticals in keeping with the Justice Ginsburg rule.
So I guess what troubles me is this. You style yourself an originalist, textualist, factualist, whatever the term is, which means you go right to the words and try to understand the words in their original meaning. And so if I change Senator Feinstein's question and didn't ask you whether the president has the authority to unilaterally delay a general election, asked you instead, does the president have the authority to unilaterally deny the right to vote to any person based on their race? What would your answer be?
Well, Senator, obviously there are many laws in effect, including the Equal Protection Clause, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, including the 15th Amendment, which protects the right to vote against discrimination based on race. And so there's a principle in constitutional law called external constraints. And even if one evaluates what the authority a branch might have to act, there are external constraints that press in from other parts of the Constitution. Here, it would be the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Well, of course it would. The 15th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race. For an originalist and a textualist, that is clear text as I see it. But when asked whether or not the president has any authority to unilaterally deny that right to vote for a person based on race or even gender, are you saying you can't answer that question?
Senator, I just referenced the 14th and 15th Amendments, the same one that you just repeated back to me, that do prohibit discrimination on the basis of race in voting. So as I said, I don't know how else I can say it, the Constitution contains provisions that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race in voting.
But whether a president can unilaterally deny, you're not going to answer yes or no.
Well, Senator, you've asked a couple different questions about what the president might be able to unilaterally do, and I think that I really can't say anything more than I'm not going to answer hypotheticals.
It strains originalism. If the clear wording of the Constitution establishes a right and you will not acknowledge it.
Well, Senator, it would strain the canons of conduct, which don't permit me to offer off-the-cuff reactions or any opinions outside of the judicial decision-making process. It would strain Article 3, which prevents me from deciding legal issues outside the context of cases and controversies, and as Justice Ginsburg said, it would display disregard for the whole judicial process.
So then let's take it to the case we've discussed before, Cantor versus Barr.
Okay.
Your 37-page dissent in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And yesterday, the junior senator from Missouri, in an attempt to rehabilitate the witness, asked you, you never say that the right to vote is somewhat secondary or less than any other right. Is that fair to say? And you answered, yes, that is fair to say. I never said that. I have read and reread this. I'm not ready for a question on the final, but I've read and reread your dissent on this. I'd like to read to you what you wrote on this very question asked by the senator from Missouri. In sum, well, I think we need to establish what this case is about for those who may not know or remember. Ricky Cantor. Ricky Cantor was a con man, lived in Wisconsin. He manufactured some kind of shoe insert, a pad, and tried to sell it to people who had diabetes or some foot problems. He wanted the Medicare to say that it was approved. They didn't. He sold it anyway and made that representation. When it was all over, it came crashing around him. He cheated Medicare out of $375,000. He was found guilty of a count of mail fraud, paid $300,000 in penalties and fines. He paid out $27 million in a civil settlement and then spent a year in federal prison. So this was not some run-of-the-mill miscreant. This was a fellow who was a con artist. He came to the federal courts and said, this is unfair. I've served my year in prison. Now I want to buy a gun. And the law says I can't buy a gun if I'm guilty of a felony. And the court said, sorry, Ricky, you can't buy a gun because you are guilty of a felony. Even the Heller decision, Justice Scalia said that felonies and mental illness could continue to disqualify a person from buying a gun in this country. 2 out of 3 judges who heard this case said, that's right, that's the law. Sorry, Ricky, no AK-47 for your birthday. But then you took a look at it and reached the opposite conclusion and did extensive research and delving into history about whether or not violent felonies should be distinguished from regular felonies. And you concluded that you believed that a person who has just been found guilty or convicted of a felony should not be disqualified from their Second Amendment rights, that should be confined to those who were dangerous, guilty of a violent felony. Here's what you said to go to the question that was asked by the senator from Missouri. Here are your words. In sum, the available evidence suggests that the right to arms differs from rights that depend on civic virtue for enjoyment. The Second Amendment confers an individual right intimately connected with the natural right of self-defense and not limited to civic participation. By the very terms of the civic rights argument, then, the right to arms would have been treated differently than things like the right to vote or sit on juries. So here's what it boils down to. After Heller, after the decision, after Scalia's statement, you concluded that any felony can take away your right to vote, but only a violent felony can take away your right to purchase an AK-47. Why?
Senator, with respect, that's distorting my position. What I said in that case, which is what Heller said and which is conventional in all discussions of this, to my knowledge, is that the right to vote is fundamental. However, it is an individual fundamental right that we possess, but we possess it as part of our civic responsibility for the common good. The same thing is true, for example, of jury service. Whereas individual rights, and this is again a distinction that's drawn in case law, individual rights benefit more the individual. And the entire dispute in Heller was that the majority thought that the Second Amendment was an individual right, and the dissent thought it was one that was a civic right, that was a right that people possessed, but they possessed for the benefit of society by participation in the militia. And it is a distortion of the case to say that I ever said that voting is a second-class right. That's simply not what that passage means.
But the very terms of the civic rights argument, then, the right to arms would have been treated differently than rights like the right to vote. And let's get down to the bottom line here. Heller did establish the individual right. When you finished with your dissent, here's what it came down to say. If you are guilty of a felony that is not violent, you can lose your right to vote, but you can't lose your right to buy a gun. Am I wrong?
Senator, Cantor had nothing to do with the right to vote. The point that I was making in that passage, the 14th Amendment actually expressly allows for states to deprive felons of the right to vote. And my point was that there was no similar language in the Second Amendment. I don't have an opinion and have never expressed one about the scope of a legislature's authority to take away felon voting rights. What I said is that there was a history of such provisions in state constitutions and in the federal constitution, but I did not intend, and if my words communicated that, it was a miscommunication. I've never denigrated the right to vote.
And I think it was, at best, a serious miscommunication. I'd like to read to you, in this very room in 2005, an exchange that took place between Senator Kennedy and Judge Roberts. Senator Kennedy said, let's start with the Voting Rights Act. Most Americans think that the right to vote is among the most important tools that they have to participate in our democracy. You do agree, don't you, Judge Roberts, that the right to vote is a fundamental constitutional right? Judge Roberts says, it is preservative. I think of all other rights. Without access to the ballot box, people are not in the position to protect any other rights that are important to them. And so I think it's one, as you said, the most precious rights we have as Americans. Do you understand why I read your lengthy dissent here, where somehow or another you could say to Ricky Cantor, sorry you can't vote anymore, but buy any guns you wish. We treat those rights differently. Can you see why that would be troubling based on what Justice Roberts said?
I don't actually, Senator Durbin, because I've expressly testified here that I think voting is a fundamental right, and I didn't say to the contrary in that dissent.
Well, I read it otherwise, and I read it and reread it, so I won't get that right on your final, but I will tell you, from the way I see your language, it is explicit. You have two categories of rights, one that's independent, or one that's individual, and another that is based on collective action, as in juries, as in voting as a group of the populace. And you've made a distinction there that I think is hard to understand, difficult to explain, and inconsistent with what Justice Roberts told us at this point. I'd like to move on to another. Leave it open. I want you to have the last word on this, please.
No, I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have.
Well, let me go to the poster behind me and introduce you to another family. This week I shared two stories of what's at stake with this, your nomination, ahead of the November 10th oral arguments in California versus Texas, which will decide the future of the Affordable Care Act. This is a family, and included in it is Jared Ray of Buffalo Grove, Illinois. He's on the right. Earlier this year, Jared, 20 years old, began experiencing serious headaches. After a month of suffering, he asked his father Mike to take him to the emergency room. A CT scan revealed a mass on Jared's brain, immediately transported to Evanston Hospital for surgery. Weeks later, they learned the devastating news. Jared was diagnosed with medulloblastoma, a cancerous brain tumor on the cerebellum. I'm sorry to say it's one we're familiar with here in the Senate. Senator McCain suffered from a similar situation. Post-surgery, Jared began an aggressive 6-week proton radiation protocol, currently on first round of 8 chemotherapy treatments at Lurie Children's in Chicago. His treatment costs have now added up to $700,000 and continue. Fortunately, the ACA permits Jared to remain covered by his mom's health insurance until the age of 26. That law also ensures no lifetime limits on her policy so that they can continue to give Jared the treatment that he wanted and needs. When sharing her son's story, his mom, Mary, said, any parent would be shocked and terrified in this situation. If the ACA is abolished and if my employer elects not to offer coverage for dependents up until age 26, that puts Jared at risk of being uninsured and uninsurable because he will clearly have a pre-existing condition. Jared's father added, Jared would not have access to this type of care if it were not for the Affordable Care Act because he wouldn't be insured. It's been a huge benefit. Judge, last week in your prepared testimony you said, quote, the policy decisions and value judgments of government must be made by political branches elected by and accountable to the people. The public should not expect courts to do so, and the courts should not try. Well, thankfully, Judge, the political branches elected by the people passed and enacted the Affordable Care Act. The problem is now that the Republicans are doing everything they can to take away this protection. And they can't do it through elected officials. They tried over and over and over in the House and in the Senate. And I mentioned Senator McCain earlier in this statement. I'll never forget it, and neither will any of us who were on the floor that night when he walked through those doors at 1:30 a.m., voting no and saving the health insurance of 23 million Americans and protections for 100 million or more. They couldn't repeal the Affordable Act in Congress. Now they've taken it to the Supreme Court. It isn't a casual decision. This administration decided that instead of defending an existing law, they would attack an existing law along with the Republican attorneys general who've gathered for this purpose. They have good reason to believe they're going to be successful. As I mentioned yesterday, right-wing judicial activists have repeatedly stepped in to overturn decisions of the elected branches of government. Activists judging including rolling back campaign finance laws in Citizens United and voting rights protections away in Shelby County. The tool of choice of these activists is a supposedly neutral judicial philosophy of originalism and textualism, which gives judges the ability to substitute their own judgment for the elected branches and to strike down and restrict laws that are disfavored by powerful special interest. President Trump has been open in acknowledging that he wants a nominee on the court to strike down that ACA. You have said you have not made any agreements or statements to the contrary, but I will tell you, it is a cloud over your nomination, because he has over and over again. He's nominated other such advocates of originalism and textualism to carry out his political purposes. I'm afraid of the impact of that repeal on people like Jared. So we've been told that you're following the Ginsburg rule: no hints, no previews, no forecast. In fact, during her confirmation hearing, Justice Ginsburg did answer substantive legal questions about matters that might come before the court, such as the right to choose. Yesterday, you had one notable and selective departure from your interpretation of the Ginsburg rule. When it comes to California versus Texas, the Republican challenge to the Affordable Care Act, you repeatedly claim that the deciding question in the case is severability, not the individual mandate. That's a legal opinion. But the court will only reach the severability question if it first finds that eliminating the penalty for the individual mandate rendered the individual mandate unconstitutional. Isn't that right?
Senator, what I meant by that is that even if the mandate is unconstitutional, severability would, if it is severable, then the statute would stand. And so if the mandate is constitutional, then yes, the law would stand. But I said that the emphasis, and I've gotten a lot of questions about severability for this reason, and much of the commentary in the legal news about this is focused on severability, because it means that whatever the holding is on the mandate, the severability question is the one that would be determinative, even if the mandate were held unconstitutional. So it's a descriptive. I didn't say how I would rule on severability, and I didn't say whether I would interpret the zeroed out provision to be a penalty rather than a tax.
But you see, that second part, penalty tax, you've already addressed that, haven't you?
No, I haven't. The writing that I've done before that I assume you're referring to addressed a different provision that wasn't zeroed out. This is now an amended provision, so it's a different provision before the court.
But you're on record for criticizing Chief Justice Roberts' opinion that the individual mandate is constitutional, haven't you?
I am on record saying that I thought that the majority opinion was a less plausible interpretation of the statute than that of the dissent. Again, that was an academic writing, number one. Number two, it was on different issues than those are presented in California versus Texas. And number three, I think you're suggesting that I have some hostility to the ACA, which I assure you that I don't. And I think, Senator Durbin, there's actually something you and I agree on here. Judicial activism is bad from either side. And no matter what somebody's policy preferences are about the ACA, I completely agree with you. They shouldn't be trying to undermine the policy that Congress enacted. So you and I agree on that, and I embrace that view of a judge's role wholeheartedly.
Thanks, Judge Barrett.
We'll do Senator Lee, White House, and Cruz, and break for lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit to the record a letter from the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Without objection.
Judge Barrett, I want to talk about religious freedom for a moment. As I mentioned the other day, I think you and I share something in common on this, an enthusiasm for religious freedom. As I mentioned the other day, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have been no strangers to religious persecution, even in this country, unfortunately. On October 27, 1838, the governor of Missouri ordered us exterminated. It wasn't nice, but, you know, I assume he had his reasons. He believed we were heretics, and I'm sure we are heretics in the eyes of many, but we try to be really nice heretics. And it wasn't until the late 70s that the governor of Missouri actually lifted that ban. I'm sure Josh Hawley, as Attorney General, would have lifted it for us had it not been lifted by then. Religious liberty has always been interesting to me for that reason, and also just as a lawyer. My late father, who was also a lawyer, worked on and advised Congress regarding the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And my longtime professional mentor and former boss, Gene Scher, was someone who I worked with in establishing a first-of-its-kind religious institutions practice group a couple of decades ago. Catholics, like members of my faith, have also been subjected to religious persecution from time to time. And in many cases were directly targeted through so-called Blaine amendments, provisions worked into a number of state constitutions, really for, in many cases, blatantly anti-Catholic purposes. These Blaine amendments had, of course, as their purpose the restricting of public funds going to certain religious institutions, including schools. Thankfully, earlier this year, the Supreme Court in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue struck another blow against Blaine amendments by reinforcing their earlier decision in the Trinity Lutheran case. Would you discuss briefly with us the Supreme Court's recent jurisprudence on this issue regarding Blaine amendments and how they intersect with religious freedom?
Sure. So the Supreme Court's recent decisions get at the principle that while, we have to be careful about the Establishment Clause, right? So there's a line of cases saying, a state or federal government clearly can't establish a church, and so we have a line of cases about what that means. But at the same time, Espinoza being an example, the court has been very clear that religious institutions can't be discriminated against or excluded from public programs simply because they are religious.
Now, during your time on the Seventh Circuit, you've been able to handle some cases involving religious freedom issues. For example, you joined a majority opinion in the Gruscott case, upholding the freedom of a Jewish religious school and its authority, its own discretion to hire teachers at its school. Now, that ruling was challenged before the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court denied certiorari in that case. But nonetheless, a 7-2 majority of the Supreme Court in the Our Lady of Guadalupe case ended up essentially adopting a position similar to that which you joined in the case I just mentioned, in the Our Lady of Guadalupe case. Can you talk to us just a little bit about that opinion and about the Seventh Circuit opinion and its application of the ministerial exemption?
Sure. So the ministerial exemption, as you say, the court had described it in Hosanna Tabor. The ministerial exception gives religious institutions discretion to hire, and in the case of a school, teachers. It's called who are ministers. And what this gets at, or what this requires courts to do, is to decide who is a minister. And on the one hand, there may be some which you could plainly, what might be more obvious questions, like, someone who teaches religion teachers. So what the court has said is, those would follow more in the heartland. It gets a little bit more difficult if you have a religious school like the Jewish school in Gruscott or the Catholic school in Our Lady of Guadalupe, who has a teacher that's like, say, for example, teaching math. And then the courts have to come up with a test to decide whether such a person is a minister or not. And what Gruscott and Our Lady of Guadalupe said is it's a multi-factor test where no one factor is determinative. So it can't be determinative just that the teacher teaches math rather than religion. For example, in Gruscott, the teacher spent time teaching Jewish prayers and saying Jewish prayers with the class. And the school considered it part of the teacher's duty to form the students, to teach them about Jewish prayers and to form them in that tradition. So even though she spent other time in the curriculum teaching other matters, it viewed that as part of her job, and the school viewed her as a minister. And so Our Lady of Guadalupe gives a lot of deference to the school's characterization of whether someone is a minister or not to encourage discrimination, of course, but simply to protect religious freedom. So at a Catholic school, the teacher may teach math, but also prays with the students in the morning, attends Mass with them during the week, and is considered by the school, say in Our Lady of Guadalupe, to be someone who is also forming children in the faith. So it's really about what the scope of that ministerial exception is and how you identify whether someone is a minister.
Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful. When you came in front of this committee in 2017, we're talking about just over 3 years ago, for your confirmation to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, you said, quote, "If there is ever a conflict between a judge's personal conviction and that judge's duty under the rule of law, it is never permissible for that judge to follow their personal convictions in the decision of the case rather than what the law requires." You still stand by that statement?
I do.
I've got some colleagues on the other side of the aisle who seem to want to focus on statements made in your personal capacity and in your capacity as a private citizen and a member of your faith, as opposed to addressing actual cases dealing with abortion. I have a hunch that this is because your record on the Seventh Circuit actually shows that you're able to set aside your personal convictions, because that's what you've done when they've conflicted with your duty under the rule of law. In Price versus Chicago, for example, I assume you remember that case. It's a case in which you joined a Seventh Circuit panel opinion affirming the legality of a Chicago buffer zone law, which places limits on pro-life activists as they're demonstrating, exercising their First Amendment rights outside of abortion clinics. I assume that was the case because there was binding Supreme Court precedent on the abortion buffer zone issue. Is that right, or do you want to tell me a little bit about your reasoning in that case?
So the panel held that the issue was squarely controlled by the Supreme Court's decision in Hill versus Colorado.
So there was binding precedent on point, and so you followed that precedent, and you did so as a jurist, rather than following whatever personal predilection might have otherwise guided you or any other member of that panel. In Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky versus Commissioner of Indiana State Department of Health, you joined a dissent written by Judge Frank Easterbrook of the Seventh Circuit. And the Supreme Court later agreed with you in a 7-2 decision with respect to the Indiana law requiring fetal remains to be buried or cremated following an abortion. A position that garners a 7-vote majority on the Supreme Court these days, at least a 7-2 decision that includes Justice Breyer and Justice Kagan. Does not seem very radical to me. Do you disagree? Am I missing something about that?
The Supreme Court summarily reversed, which means without argument and briefing, the panel's holding in that case that the fetal remains, the disposition of fetal remains portion of that statute wasn't rational.
I'll note for the record here, I don't think I've ever heard anyone characterize as a radical act of conservative activism a 7-2 decision joined by Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer. Judge Barrett, in addition to being able to set aside your personal convictions when deciding a case, you've also demonstrated the ability to expertly determine what the law requires. This stems, I believe, from a fundamental and I believe correct view that a judge needs to start from the premise that the law provides an answer. The fact that legal disputes can be difficult and reasonable minds might disagree as to them doesn't excuse the judge in believing that there is a right answer. And you seem to follow with that, and it shows up in your work in a way that reflects very well on you. The Congressional Research Service conducted a review of your cases from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and determined that your decisions, and this is a quote, evince case-by-case consideration of the relevant law and facts without any clear overarching trend toward either expanding or narrowing Fourth Amendment protections, close quote. Now, this is exactly what I would expect from a textualist originalist on an issue that, like the Fourth Amendment, can actually be politically charged. But with the textualist originalist, this is exactly what you'd expect to see, somebody who doesn't appear to be a partisan one way or another and comes down on both sides, on the government side and on the non-government side. This would also account for a variety of outcomes in your cases, because you're not aiming for an overarching trend in outcomes. Your analysis seems sometimes to come out in favor of a defendant, sometimes in favor of the government. I find your dissents and your concurring opinions in panel decisions to demonstrate this commitment to following the law as it's written, rather than on the basis of some external objective. Can you tell us why you felt the need to dissent in the case of Schmidt versus Foster?
Yes. So Schmidt versus Foster involved a state court case. It came up through the Wisconsin courts. And in the case, there was a question of whether the defendant could raise a defense under Wisconsin law called adequate provocation for having murdered his wife. The case wound its way through the Wisconsin courts, and the defendant argued that an ex parte examination of the judge at which his counsel was present but not permitted to speak did not violate the Sixth Amendment, because in that case, the defendant, they didn't want to preview his case for the prosecutor, and so he didn't want the prosecutor in the room. So the judge said, well, I will allow that, but only if your attorney doesn't speak, because, if we're not going to preview your case for the prosecution and not permit the prosecutor to be here, that was how he's going to do it. So then the judge proceeded to ask the defendant questions to decide whether he could make an adequate provocation defense, and concluded that he could not. In that case, the Wisconsin courts held that this proceeding did not violate the defendant's right to counsel, this, telling his counsel that he couldn't speak. It came to my court under 2254, which is the state habeas statute permitting collateral review of state convictions. But EDPA requires very heavy deference to state courts. You can only disturb a state court holding, for example, on a matter of law, determination on a matter of law, if no reasonable jurist could reach that conclusion, or it has to be in conflict with clearly established Supreme Court law. And in that case, I made clear that it wasn't up to us to decide whether we thought as an original matter, just if the case had just come up before us, whether that violated the Sixth Amendment, because as the panel majority, which then became a dissent when the case went en banc, said this was an unprecedented kind of hearing, which, if it was unprecedented, meant that there was no clearly established Supreme Court law on point. So the decision in that case was driven by federalism and by the statutory instruction that federal courts give deference to state courts.
Thank you. In another case, United States versus Wilson, I believe that was a case in which you agreed with the majority in concluding that the officers acted with reasonable suspicion based on the circumstances of the case and the detention there involving a flight by the individual from the scene. But you wrote separately. Tell us why you wrote separately in that case.
So that case, if I have the case correctly, so I've been almost 600 cases, but I think I know the case that you're talking about. I think that was a case where police had a tip about some criminal activity, and there were a group of men in a park. The police approached the park, and then they went up to talk to one of the men at the park because they noticed a bulge in his pocket. He was wearing gym shorts or some sort of athletic shorts that showed a bulge. And the police approached the man, and he fled. And under Supreme Court case law, the determinative question for a seizure is, whether the person fled and then was detained, then seized by the police. The other way that could have been justified is if, as a matter of a Terry stop is the case, the police had reasonable suspicion to approach him just because they saw the bulge in his pocket. And I wrote separately because I thought that the policeman's basis for stopping him, if this really had just been a Terry stop based on reasonable suspicion, was questionable because they really had, they had an anonymous tip. The people in the park didn't match the description of the description given in the anonymous tip. All they saw was a bulge in the pocket. So if he had not fled, I thought the case should have just talked about the flight, because if he had not fled, I was pretty dubious that would have been a justified stop.
I admire your decision to write separately in that case. I think that shows real courage and moral and judicial leadership to speak out and write separately when the occasion requires it. And you did so here with nothing to gain from it. You did so because it was important to point that out under the law, and I respect that a lot. In the couple minutes we've got left, I wanted to ask you more broadly about something I've noticed in reviewing letters and other materials we've received in response to your nomination. I've noticed that there's a common theme among your law clerks and your students. They feel like you see them as individuals, and they feel mentored and taught by you. Tell us a little bit about that. I'd love to hear, for example, how you go about deciding who to hire as your law clerks, and how you mentor them as they go through their year studying with you.
So over my teaching career, I've taught roughly 2,000 students. And now I have, as a judge, 4 law clerks per year. And then I also continue to teach at least a seminar in which I have like 15 or so students usually. And, what I'm looking for in a law clerk, of course, is, excellent legal ability, because I need the help, to do the legal research and all of that sort of thing. So I want someone who has excellent legal ability. I want someone who has integrity. I want someone who isn't afraid to push back and express his or her own opinions, but at the same time realizes that, I am the boss, and if I disagree, then they're going to have to go along ultimately. But I also want clerks who are, and this is part of the integrity, who have character. Our chambers is small. If someone had, say, sharp elbows, in a chambers that only has 6 people, my assistant, the 4 law clerks, and me, or that showed disrespect or arrogance, that would make for a pretty miserable year for everyone. And I've not been disappointed. Every one of my law clerks has fit that bill. And so I view it as my duty with my law clerks, much like with my students, to encourage them to enter the profession as full people who hopefully have gained some knowledge of the law in their time with me, and also seeing how they can, live a life where people can disagree without being disagreeable.
Thank you, Judge Barrett. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Judge Barrett.
Senator?
First, if I may, Chairman, let me ask unanimous consent that an essay I wrote for the Harvard Journal on Legislation called Dark Money and U.S. Courts be admitted to the record.
Without objection.
That a report that Senate Democrats prepared called Captured Courts be admitted to the record, and that an article by Christopher Leonard in the New York Times called Charles Koch's Big Bet on Barrett, describing his activating his political network to support Judge Barrett's nomination, also be entered to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Judge Barrett, on the Seventh Circuit, you are subject to a code of ethics, are you not?
I am.
And I presume you are okay with that?
Of course.
In fact, I would submit you probably think that's a good thing.
Yes.
And indeed, it is true of all the circuit courts that they're subject to pretty much the same code of ethics, correct?
Yes.
It gets different at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is not subject to a code of ethics, is it?
The canons of judicial conduct that apply to lower court judges do not apply to the Supreme Court, although I do believe it's the practice of the Supreme Court to follow them.
Yeah, they do not apply, we agree. And indeed, going to the Supreme Court can interrupt an ethics investigation, as we saw with Justice Kavanaugh, who had an ongoing ethics investigation in his circuit that was interrupted by his elevation to the Supreme Court without having concluded. Let me first ask you, there's no such thing with you, correct? We have no Seventh Circuit ethics investigation going on that would be interrupted by your elevation to the Supreme Court.
I'm not aware of any ethics
I suspect you would be, so good. We can put that behind us. With respect to reporting of gifts, of travel, of hospitality, of what the Constitutional might call emoluments, all of the circuits have a pretty solid rule about reporting those, and you comply with that rule on the Seventh Circuit, do you not?
I do. It might even be by statute that we have to do that, but I do.
Yes. And the rule, I don't know how familiar you are with this, so I'll offer this as a proposition. The rule that you follow and the way in which circuit judges follow it aligns quite well with the reporting requirements that in the executive branch members of the cabinet have to do when they get gifts, travel, hospitality, and other emoluments. And it aligns quite well with the reporting that members of Congress have to do when we get gifts of travel or hospitality or other such emoluments. The discrepancy here is with the Supreme Court, which has a much lower standard of transparency and disclosure about those very same things. So it's a bit of a mystery when I see the situation that when you go up to the court, you will be not subject to the code of ethics that you're subject to now or any other, and you will have lower reporting requirements than you do now or that any of us do. And I flag that for you because I think it's anomalous that the highest court should have the lowest standards. And I don't know if you want to say something about that. At a minimum, I hope you'll keep an open mind about trying to fix that when you're on the court. If you have a defense of why the highest court should have a lowest standard, have at it now.
I didn't know. I know that the justices file financial disclosure reports. I've never looked at one. I didn't know that they were different or that it was a lower standard from the ones that the rest of us
Okay, well,
file.
take a look at that when you get up there. This is a matter I think that the court handles administratively.
I've never interrupted
judicially.
anybody, but can I just ask one question?
Of course.
Now that you know that, how do you feel about it?
That the
Does that
Supreme
stop my
Court-
time while you're answering the chairman's question?
Time, but I think it's a good question. Now that you know, how do you feel about it?
I guess, as I just said to Senator Whitehouse, I'm surprised because I did think it was by a statute that applied to everyone. So I'm surprised. I've always complied with filling out my financial disclosure reports. And as I'm sure it may have been for you all, it's a little uncomfortable the first time to make your finances available. Anybody can request it. But I've always complied.
For the record, it's a question of interpretation and practice. And Senator Graham and I have actually had public conversations about trying to remedy this with a legislative fix. So you've got that potentially coming your way. So I flagged that for you. The second thing, another topic I'd like to raise with you is you've repeatedly mentioned during this hearing the phrase about litigation winding its way up through the courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court. And you've described that process of winding its way as an important restraint on judicial activism. that you got to wait till a case gets to you in the ordinary course, correct?
Correct.
That's a fair description of where you've been?
Correct.
Yeah, and ordinarily, I don't know if you've ever done a case, but ordinarily when you do a case, it begins with a person, right?
Correct.
And that person feels an injury,
Yes.
and then that person goes to a lawyer,
Yes.
and then that lawyer goes on their behalf to court
And files a complaint.
and files a complaint, and then in court, they try to win and vindicate their injury. That's kind of the basic standard way in which this works.
Yes.
So it gets a little weird sometimes, and that's a circumstance I'd like to bring up to you because it touches on some of the stuff that I addressed yesterday. One case, it's not even a case. Let me call, Janice,
Yes.
okay? Let's describe this as the Janice saga because it's more than really one case. And it's really about a completely different case called Abood. You're familiar with the Abood decision.
Yes.
So the Abood decision was precedent for what, 40 years?
I can't remember when Abood was decided, but it was precedent before Janice.
Yeah, and roughly 40 years, I'll tell you. And had repeatedly been reaffirmed,
It was a longstanding precedent.
on which there was considerable reliance.
Let's see. So Janice did overrule that precedent, and so Janice did go through the application of the stare decisis factors in deciding whether to overrule it,
Right.
whether that
And there
conclusion
was in
right or
fact
wrong.
reliance in the 40 years that it had been the law of the land on the question of the union question that it had resolved.
Well, I don't want to second guess or criticize or praise the majority in Janice's
I'm not asking you to, I'm
calculation.
asking you as a matter of fact, had 20-plus states relied on it?
Well, Senator, I think reliance and the degree of reliance on Abood
Okay.
is a legal question.
We'll just leave that then. So the Janice saga begins actually with a case called Knox, in which Justice Alito took a shot at Abood. He criticized it as substantially impinging upon First Amendment rights of union members. For people who are watching, the Abood case was about the right of a labor union to get compensated, not dues, but just compensation from non-members when in their representation of their members, they get added benefits for the people who are not members. So not the most exciting part of the law, but settled this question of when labor unions could get compensated for work they do for non-members. But Justice Alito did not like it. He took a shot at it in Knox versus SEIU, and the concurrence in that case said, whoa, wait a minute. Quote, the majority's choice to reach an issue not presented by the parties, briefed or argued, disregards our rules. But Justice Alito didn't like something about Abood, and so he took that shot. Then we went on to a later decision called Harris v. Quinn. Alito took another shot at Abood in that case, describing Abood as having analysis that is questionable. He undertook an extended critique of the decision, describing it as having questionable foundations. Justice Kagan spotted that, and in her dissent, she said, today's majority cannot resist taking potshots at Abood, and described its critique of Abood's foundations as gratuitous dicta. But the message went out from Judge Alito that he wanted to do something about Abood. There was something about Abood that he did not like. And with that, we went to, that's the prequel. Then we went to the two cases that followed. The first one was Friedrichs, which was supposed to be the case that got rid of Abood. And it had an interesting travel because the lawyer in the case was one of these groups from Janice. It was the Center for Individual Rights right here, who was counsel. In Janice, the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation was counsel. So they switched, right? In Friedrichs, Center for Individual Rights was counsel, National Right to Work was an amicus. When it went on to Janice, they switched, National Right to Work Legal Foundation, Defense Foundation was counsel, and Center for Individual Rights was an amicus. And from everything that I see, it looks like they actually went out and found the plaintiff. So back to our earlier discussion, it wasn't the injured person that went and hired a lawyer. It was the legal group that went and found a plaintiff. And then they went to court, which everybody does, but it got interesting there because there the lawyers asked to lose. I don't know if you've ever been in a case in which the lawyers asked to lose before. I never have been. I've never litigated against anybody who asked to lose. Have you ever been in a case in which a party asked to lose?
No, I don't think I've ever experienced that.
Yeah, I can imagine not. So these groups with all this money behind them from Donors Trust and Bradley Foundation and all come into court and they say, please dismiss my case in the district court. Then they go up to the Ninth Circuit and they specifically ask the Ninth Circuit to get rid of their case, to uphold the decision dismissing their case, quote, as quickly as practicable and without argument. Have you ever seen a case in your circuit where somebody came in and said, I'd like to lose, and I'd like to lose as quickly as practicable, and I'd like to lose without making an argument on behalf of my client?
But Abood was controlling law at that point, right?
My question was, have you ever seen that happen in your circuit?
I have not seen that happen in my circuit.
Yeah. Okay. So then the case went on to decision, and as predicted or signaled by Justice Alito, it looked like it was going to be a 5-4 decision knocking out Abood after 40 years. Sadly and unfortunately, Justice Scalia died before that decision could be rendered, so it actually turned out to be a 4-4 decision. And as you know, a 4-4 decision, the tie goes to the decision below, and the Ninth Circuit prevailed, and so that was it for Friedrichs. But it didn't take long for this same group. So this is back to my Janus exhibit. These are all the commonly funded amici and lawyers who showed up in Janus. 11 of them had showed up in Friedrichs. So Janus was a reunion of the team. Everybody piling back in together to get what they, and there was no big rush this time, because this time they had to wait for the vacancy on the court to be filled. They didn't want a 4-4 decision. They had to wait for Justice Gorsuch. So there wasn't the same rush. The case came through more ordinary travel, and then, boom, in they went to argue it, and down came the decision. And I ask you to think that through, because I've done some appellate argument, and I've done some trial work, and I have run an awful lot of litigation. And one of the things that has been a constant for me has been the belief that even if I was kind of taking a long shot case, I'd get a fair hearing, I'd get a fair decision, and I had a shot. I've got a feeling that the lawyers going into the United States Supreme Court in that Janus case, looking at this array of commonly funded anti-union front groups assembled against them as amici, having seen what Friedrichs portended, having been signaled by Alito in those earlier cases that they wanted to get rid of Abood, that they was on the hunt for Abood. That's a feeling that no lawyer should have in America. And all I want to do is leave with you the thought that when you're on the court, I hope you will conduct yourself and see in whatever way you can that the court conducts itself in such a way that no lawyer goes into an argument in the United States Supreme Court feeling that the case is set against them and there's nothing to be done other than go in and take your medicine.
Senator Whitehouse, I will approach every case with an open mind.
So I have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to get onto a third. By the way, I'm not the only one who sees this as a saga. The dissent in Janus said, here ends the, quote, 6-year campaign to undo Abood by the majority of 5. Pretty safe to say that you don't think courts should be campaigning to reach decisions.
Without commenting on
Correct.
Janice or what happened there,
Correct.
yes, I think that judges shouldn't have campaigns.
Or projects.
I think judges should not have pet projects and they should not have campaigns. They should decide cases.
Thank you. So let's talk about, because we've had all these, I think, odiferous amici fluttering around the court without disclosing who's really behind them, let's talk about amici for a minute. First of all, on the Seventh Circuit, do you have ex parte meetings with litigants?
No.
Because why?
Well,
Because
there would
it's wrong?
yeah, sure. I mean, there are constraints against
Yeah.
doing so.
And how about with amici? If you have a case in which there is an amicus in a case that is before you, would you meet privately with the amici while the case in which they've written a brief is pending?
You mean meet privately, allow the amici to have access to the judges
Yes.
privately?
Yes.
To try to make the case? I would not do that.
No. And why would you not do that?
That would be inappropriate.
Yep. And in fact, is it possible that you could not even know who was really behind the amicus if they haven't told you?
You mean how the amicus was funded?
Correct.
To my knowledge, I'm thinking through what the disclosures are in the fronts of briefs. I mean, to my knowledge, that information is not part of what groups disclose.
Correct.
When they file amicus briefs.
Correct. There's actually a bit of a tradition that has developed that amici, in their disclosure, only describe who paid for the actual physical preparation and filing of the brief. So if you had a big interest, let's say, that went and gave a group $1 million, maybe even stood up a pop-up group out of no place and said, here's $1 million, I want you to go out and do great things. Oh, and by the way, we'd sure appreciate it if you filed an amicus brief in this matter, just don't mention us. And we'd love to give you some advice about what you should say in the amicus brief, and it would be nice if you'd let us read it before you file it so we can make sure we don't need to give you any more advice. That doesn't meet the standard of 37.6. The court and the parties would never know. And in fact, this happened in the Oracle case, in Oracle versus Google. Turns out that Oracle had given up to $99,000, according to their disclosure, to something called the Internet Accountability Project, which filed a brief and didn't disclose that Oracle, a party in the case, had given it $99,000. And Internet Accountability Project was basically a pop-up. Somebody established it, it took the money, it wrote the brief. There's a group that has more cred that's been around longer called the American Conservative Union, which was given up to $500,000 by Oracle and filed a brief in the Oracle case and didn't disclose that it had been given that kind of money by Oracle. Isn't that the kind of stuff that parties ought to know, that the public ought to know, and that the court ought to know?
I didn't know that until you just shared that information with me.
Well, think about it, because I think it's something that the public and the parties and the court ought to know. Because if what you have is amicus groups that are coming in flying false flags, not revealing whose interests they're really there to support, and potentially teeing up arguments and ideas that will benefit the secret funders, that will maybe tee up for a case they know is coming but isn't this case, but if they can tilt the law a little bit in it, it can have an effect later on. Other parties should know that. So I urge you to consider that, and I'm 13 seconds out, so I'll leave it with that. Please think about these things. There is something that is not right about the way this is happening, and I urge you, and I urge anybody from the court who is listening, to try to sincerely try to clean this mess up, because it is not good for the court. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say, first of all, the last 3 days of hearings have revealed very good news. They have revealed the news that Judge Barrett is going to be confirmed by this committee and by the full Senate. With 2 full days of questioning, we've seen that our Democratic colleagues have very few questions actually to raise about Judge Barrett's qualifications. Very little of the time we've spent in here has concerned her record as a judge, her 20 years as a respected scholar. Instead, much of this hearing has focused on political attacks directed at President Trump. I recognize our Democratic colleagues are not going to be voting for President Trump in November. That's certainly their prerogative. But they've largely abandoned even trying to make the case that Judge Barrett is anything other than exceptionally well qualified to serve as a justice. It is striking that as we sit here right now in this committee room, there are only 2 Democratic senators in the room. If you look at the dais, there's chair after chair after chair that is empty. The Democratic senators are no longer even attending. I assume they'll show up for their time. But it is indicative of what they're tacitly admitting, which is that they don't have substantive criticisms.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a point of personal privilege?
Of course.
We're in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis, a pandemic, and some members are in their offices following this on television, and to suggest their absence here means they're not following or participating is incorrect.
I would note the senator from Illinois, in his personal privilege, somehow omitted the fact that all but 2 of the Democrats were physically here yesterday, and after the questioning, they made the decision not to be here. That's fine. You're welcome to make that decision, but it's indicative when it comes to the time of the questioning that this side of the aisle does not have arguments against Judge Barrett that have any chance of prevailing. I do want to address a couple of the individual points that have been made. So many of the Democratic senators have talked about Obamacare at great length. At times I have been confused and I thought we were on the Health Committee instead of the Judiciary Committee because it has been such a central talking point for every Democrat that if President Trump is reelected, they assert everyone with pre-existing conditions is going to be denied health care and people will be dying in the streets. And I get that's their reelection message. It's not actually connected to reality. It's not actually true. Every member of the Senate agrees we're going to protect pre-existing conditions. And I would note that not a one of the Democratic senators who raised that point have addressed the very real and catastrophic failures under Obamacare. Obamacare has doubled the profits of the big health insurance companies, doubled them. Obamacare has been great corporate welfare for giant health insurance companies. At the same time, according to the Kaiser Foundation, premiums, average families' premiums, have risen more than $7,967 per year on average. That is catastrophic that millions of Americans can't afford health care. It is a catastrophic failure of Obamacare. And none of that has anything to do with Judge Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court. That is a very good argument for members of the Senate to be having. And yes, we should be protecting pre-existing conditions and expanding competition, expanding options, and lowering premiums. This body will continue to debate that, but Judge Barrett will not be the decision maker on what the appropriate approach to health care is as a policy matter. A second point I want to address, Senator Durbin had an exchange with Judge Barrett about the right to vote and also about the Second Amendment. Now, as a policy matter, many Senate Democrats, number one, want to see the Second Amendment abridged to the maximum extent possible. And number two, many Senate Democrats have decided as a policy matter that they would like to see as many felons as possible able to vote. That it is, one would presume, they have made a determination it's in their political interest to have more felons, more convicted murderers, more convicted rapists more people convicted of domestic abuse voting, that they've made an assessment that that helps their prospects on Election Day. They're entitled to make that policy determination, and different states have made different determinations about in what circumstances felons should be allowed to vote, in what circumstances felons should not be allowed to vote. I, for one, am a bit puzzled. I'm not sure our democracy is better by changing the law to allow murderers to vote. I'm not sure the operation of the republic would be better if Charles Manson had a greater voice in the electoral system. And I would note one of our colleagues, Senator Sanders from Vermont, in the course of the Democratic presidential primaries, argued not just felons who are out of jail, he argued that felons in jail, literally Charles Manson, serving a life sentence, or I think multiple life sentences for murder, should be able to vote. It's a policy matter. I think that's pretty out there. But the interesting thing is, Judge Barrett wasn't called upon to make a determination whether it's a policy matter, every felon should vote, or no felon should vote, or somewhere in between. Rather, she was doing a very different thing, which is applying the law. And Judge Barrett, did I hear you correctly that when you were describing your dissent in the counter case, that one of the reasons you said that there was a difference in the law as it concerned voting versus the Second Amendment is because the 14th Amendment, the text of the 14th Amendment explicitly contemplates legislatures making restrictions on voting based on whether you've committed a crime? Is that right?
That's right.
And I actually have the text of the amendment because Senator Durbin was highly critical. As a policy matter, he wants those felons voting. But he didn't, in fact, address the legal issue that as a judge, Judge Barrett was obliged to address. And Section 2 of the 14th Amendment provides in relevant part, but when the right to vote at any election is denied or is in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime. Well, Senator Durbin may not like that the 14th Amendment explicitly contemplates that if you commit a crime, if you're a felon, you may forfeit your right to vote, but that is in the text of the Constitution. And as a judge, Judge Barrett would be not doing her job were she not to look at the text of the Constitution and follow the text of the Constitution. Am I right, Judge Barrett, that the Second Amendment doesn't have similar language suggesting or other crime or anything comparable to that?
You are correct.
All right, a third point. There's been some discussion from Democratic members raising the question of the Federalist Society and dark money and all sorts of mysterious connections. Now, Judge Barrett, am I right that at least for a period of time you were a member of the Federalist Society? Is that right?
While I was on the faculty as a full-time tenured professor.
And you've spoken at some Federalist Society events. Is that accurate as well?
I have.
In your time dealing with the Federalist Society, have they ever lobbied you to take a particular position?
They have not.
In your time as a judge, has the Federalist Society ever filed a brief in your court urging an outcome in a particular case?
It's my understanding the Federalist Society doesn't litigate. They have not ever filed a brief in my court.
Your understanding is correct. The Federalist Society does not file amicus briefs. Our Democratic colleagues have been engaged in a sustained effort to try to sully the Federalist Society. It is disconnected from reality, but I will say, and I wish Senator Whitehouse were here. My intention was to have this discussion with him here because he just spoke about all the connections. He had his charts. I would note, I was feeling a little bit bad that I didn't have a chart with sort of red fuzzy yarn connecting all the things that are the deep conspiracies going on. So in that interest, I do have a chart that's a little bit smaller that has similar connections back and forth, and it is produced by, what is it, the Americans for Public Trust, and it shows the dark money connections between Senator Whitehouse and Planned Parenthood and Arabella Advisors and all of these different organizations with money flowing back and forth, all the dark money. And in fact, I would note one of those dark money organizations on the left that we talked about yesterday that is the Demand Justice Organization. I would point out the Demand Justice Organization has decided to be directly involved in these proceedings because this is a left-wing dark money organization that has posters that are right outside of this building that have pictures. Senator Lee, you're on the poster. Chairman Graham, you're on the poster. And the posters say, "Supreme Super Spreaders, Politics First, Health and Safety Last." You know what? The First Amendment's a great thing. If they want to put your pictures up, it's a pretty good picture of Senator Lee. It's not as good a picture of Chairman Graham. Needs to work on getting a better picture to them.
It's not their fault.
The Democratic dark money efforts dwarf the Republican dark money efforts, which is why, without a twinge of hypocrisy, Democratic members make this charge repeatedly. And in fact, I will point to one specific example, which is a judge, Judge John J. Jack McConnell, who's a judge in the state of Rhode Island. Now, who is Judge McConnell? Well, he used to be the treasurer of the Rhode Island Democratic Party and a director of the Rhode Island branch of Planned Parenthood. Well, how did Mr. McConnell become a judge? Well, according to CQ roll call, he contributed about $500,000 to Democratic political committees before becoming a judge. This, by the way, is more than any other judge nominated by Obama or Trump. So Judge McConnell stands at the top, $500,000. He donated $12,600 to Senator Whitehouse. He hosted a fundraiser for Senator Whitehouse at his home in Providence in 2006. Judge McConnell's wife gave another $250,000 to candidates and causes, so that's $750,000. And now Judge McConnell is a judge after Senator Whitehouse vigorously led the fight to get him appointed a judge. He sits on the Committee on Code of Conduct of the U.S. Judicial Conference. And what has he done on the Committee on Code of Conduct? He has helped lead the charge to issue a new rule to try to ban judges from being members of the Federalist Society. And to the shock of no one looking at the red yarn connections, after Judge McConnell and the committee put out this assault on the Federalist Society to prohibit judges from from being members, Senator Whitehouse and 6 other Democratic senators loudly cheered that effort in writing. Now, fortunately, that effort was roundly denounced. Over 200 federal judges signed a letter opposing this. Federalist Society takes no positions, doesn't lobby, doesn't file amicus briefs, doesn't take public policy positions. Most of its events are debates where people on the left are featured prominently. Every single U.S. Supreme Court justice, all of them, have spoken at least one Federalist Society event. And thankfully, the assault on the Federalist Society was withdrawn in the face of over 200 federal judges, and I would note 29 senators roundly criticizing the attempt. Let's turn to a fourth issue. Many Democratic members of this committee seem to be treating this hearing as a policy hearing on what's good health care policy, what's good gun policy, what's good voting rights policy. Judge Barrett, in your view, is it the responsibility of a federal judge to implement policy positions that they might happen to agree with?
That's your job, not a judge's.
I very much agree with you. You know, it's easy for someone watching these proceedings to assume both sides want the same thing, just on opposite partisan lines. It's easy for someone watching to assume, well, the Democrats, they want Democrat judges to implement their policy, and the Republicans, they want Republican judges to implement their policy. As easy as that is to assume, I don't believe that is accurate. It is certainly not accurate with respect to the sorts of judges I would like to see nominated and confirmed. And I'll give you an example of that. An issue that I am deeply passionate about is school choice. I think school choice is the civil rights issue of the next century. But I also think the right arena to fight for school choice is right here in the United States Senate. The right arena to fight for school choice is in the state legislatures. It is in the politically accountable elected legislatures. So, do I want to see a federal court issue an order mandating school choice across the country? It might be simpler if I could just convince 5 justices to order every jurisdiction in America, you must have school choice. It would be a lot easier than trying to convince 51 or 60 senators, trying to convince the House. We've gotten school choice legislation passed through this body that I've introduced, but it's been hard fought. It'd be much easier if 5 philosopher kings could just mandate it. But that would not be an appropriate judicial role. And I'm certainly not asking Judge Barrett to issue any ruling, although I believe that policy is the right policy. It's not a judge's role to mandate it. Interestingly enough, our Democratic colleagues do support judges prohibiting it. If you look at a case called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, that was a case that was a challenge to Ohio's school choice program. Ohio's school choice program gave scholarships to thousands of low-income children, mostly African-American and Hispanic children, trapped in failing schools. It gave them hope. It gave them a chance at a decent education, a chance to escape violence, a chance to have a shot at the American dream. It was immediately challenged. The case went to the Supreme Court, and by a vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court upheld the program. 4 justices were prepared to strike down that program as unconstitutional, and with it, every other school choice program in America. To rule that the Constitution doesn't let the elected legislatures decide to give scholarships to kids if they choose to go to a religious institution. As far as I'm concerned, that's a radical and activist position. 4 justices were ready to shut down school choice programs all across the country. That's an example of how one side wants the court to mandate their policy outcomes. The other side does not. I don't want school choice mandated. I want it to be left to the political process. For my last couple of minutes, I want to address one other issue, which is the issue of packing the court. We have seen repeatedly Joe Biden and Kamala Harris refuse to answer whether they would pack the court. What does it mean to pack the court? Packing the court means one very specific thing, which is expanding the number of justices to achieve a political outcome. Packing the court is wrong. It is an abuse of power. I believe, should they win in November, that our Democratic colleagues will pack the court. I think that's why Joe Biden refuses to answer it, although he did say when asked, the voters don't deserve to know his answer as to whether he'll pack the court. And what we've seen this past week is we've seen, with a message discipline that is really quite remarkable, Democratic senators all making a new argument that what Republicans have done for 4 years is packing the court. With all due respect, what utter nonsense. Filling judicial vacancies is not what that term means, and they are endeavoring to redefine the language, to set the framework, to set the predicate for a partisan assault on the court. I will read you some quotes. Joe Biden in 1983, quote, FDR's court packing idea was, quote, a boneheaded idea. It was a terrible, terrible mistake to make. And it put in question an entire decade, the independence of the most significant body in this country. Pat Leahy in 2017, quote, the Judiciary Committee once stood against a court packing scheme that would have eroded judicial independence. That was a proud moment. Senator Blumenthal, much the same. Senator Durbin, in 2018, quote, 75 years ago we went through this, and I think the Congress was correct in stopping this popular president named Franklin Roosevelt from that idea. Justice Ginsburg in 2019, quote, if anything would make the court look partisan, it would be that. One side saying we're in power, we're going to enlarge the number of justices, not fill vacancies, enlarge the number of judges, so we would have more people who would vote the way we want to. 9 seems to be a good number. It has been that way for a long time. I think it was a bad idea when President Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court. That's the next fight we're facing. If Democrats win the majority, I hope that we don't see that come to pass.
Thank you. Senator Cruz, we'll come back at 12:30, and we'll lead off with Senator Coons. 12:30.
And you've been watching live.